When I started getting back into FNAF a couple of years ago, there was this one series that would keep popping up, and after a while of ignoring it, it was everywhere. My comments, my recommended pages, and even some of my close friends occasionally talked about it. And even still, I avoided it. Five Nights at Treasure Island is infamous in the FNAF space for being the first ever fan game. Unless you were to count Pizza Massacre, which, I mean, technically you'd be right, but come on. Treasure Island is widely considered to be the first fan game to take the core ideas from the main series and incorporate their own story into the same gameplay style. Released on December 1st, 2014, Five Nights at Treasure Island rose to the top of the community for its unique take on the sit and survive formula that made the horror of the first game so iconic. That, and the fact that FNATI was based on a creepypasta, made it one of the most popular fan creations to date. While on the surface the idea of Treasure Island is pretty simple, Five Nights with messed up Disney characters, it isn't until you look further into the game and realize that this seemingly simple game spawned in one of the most devoted fandoms I've ever seen. Pair this with one of the most convoluted development histories I've ever heard of, and we have ourselves one of the most daunting series to get into. I think that's why I didn't want to either play any of the FNATI games or even attempt to talk about them in a video. It's pretty inaccessible as an outsider to even get into the games. There is so much history, and I would be concerned about not doing it justice by looking into it further. So when I finally released that obscenely long Project Readjusted retrospective last year, I thought it was finally time to give Treasure Island all the attention it deserves and really get into the history of it. But before we begin, there are some things worth bringing up to avoid confusion. I am only covering what is considered as official FNATI media. In its infancy, the very loose rights to FNATI were passed around frequently. So essentially, we're going to be covering mostly everything made by the developers when they were in control of the series. Hopefully that's not too confusing. This means we aren't covering any fan creations like Malrat's The Lost Ones games or any similar fan-inspired FNATI media. I will not be covering the FNATI story as a whole because, believe it or not, it's still ongoing in a couple of different mediums, but I will be covering the stories that are in each game. Finally, and most importantly, I will most likely get a lot wrong. I have tried my absolute best to make this video as objective as possible, especially on important details like time, place, and certain events in the community. However, because I'm trying my best to condense 10 years of a small community's history into one video, there's gonna be some errors. I'll try my best to correct any and all errors in the pinned comment. Additionally, if you notice something that might be off, leave a comment and I'll look into it. Long-winded introduction out of the way. Let's finally get into it. How many of you knew that Five Nights at Treasure Island was based on a creepypasta? It should be most of you. I think this is very common knowledge. FNATI was based on the creepypasta Abandoned by Disney, created by Slime Beast, which was released a year before FNATI in 2013. I want to make it immediately clear, I know little to nothing about creepypastas. I grew up hearing about them occasionally, but I never went out of my way to interact with them or the community they had built up. I mean, I knew Slender Man and Jeff the Killer, but apart from those two, I couldn't really tell you anything else. So I'm gonna do my best to summarize Abandoned by Disney. Abandoned by Disney tells the story of Disney's two real ghost towns, the Discovery Island, located in Bay Lake, Florida, and Mowgli's Palace in Emerald Isle, North Carolina. These are two real places on expensive pieces of land that Disney sunk millions of dollars into and then just abandoned. The protagonist ventures to Mowgli's Palace for some urban exploration. They bring along a camera to document their findings into a blog post. When they arrived and started looking around, they noticed some things seemed off. There are many other signs of life in the place as well. They just brushed it off as the mind playing tricks on them. But where the story hits a climax is when they venture into a room with costumes. The protagonist picks up a Donald Duck head and out falls a human skull onto the floor. In the center of the room lies an inverted Mickey Mouse costume. Before long it gets up and in a perfect voice says, "Hey, want to see my head come off?" The protagonist tries to leave, but as they turn around, they see "Abandoned by God," clawed into the wall. As they leave, they hear sounds of flesh ripping, the thing tearing its own head off. That's just the Cliff Notes version of Abandoned by Disney. It was actually a really good read, all things considered. Slime Beast would go on to write 3 more creepypastas in this universe. They aren't as heavily influenced in FNATI as this one was, but they still have references that I'll point out as we get there. I do highly recommend you read this for yourself, or at least watch Poster's breakdown. They're both really good. Some time had passed since the original Slime Beast creepypasta, and Five Nights at Freddy's had already taken the internet by storm. The idea of sitting in a creepy, almost dystopian place that used to provide fun and entertainment to those who chose to visit really struck a chord with horror fans. The parallels between Freddy Fazbear's and Mowgli's Palace were already there, and as we know, it didn't take very long to be adapted into a fan game. This is the very first version of Five Nights at Treasure Island. the one Markiplier and everyone else played in its infancy. It was widely considered the first fan game, or at the very least first popular fan game, as FNATI exploded in popularity seemingly overnight after Markiplier and everyone else, but mostly Markiplier, played it. The classic FNATI was created by Anart 1996 in the span of what we can assume was about a month. Anart would first reveal FNATI to the world on his DeviantArt page in early November, with a teaser showing photonegative Mickey and a Donald head. Those essentially were the only details carried over from the creepypasta at first. Everything else would be Anart's interpretation of FNAF, but at Treasure Island. Let me start off by getting it out of the way. The quality of these early versions is not very good. I'm not necessarily going to mention that going forward because it's not a useful thing to mention every time, because I'm sure you already know that just by looking at it. So take it all in. This is the starting point for many remasters and reworks and whatever else people decided the series needed. It generally improves from here. Starting off with this classic piece on the main menu, going for whatever style this is. On the menu, it's also shown that this is just a demo, so there was presumably a full game intended to come after this. And as we'll come to find, this never happened. There's one last thing about this menu before talking about the actual game. Sitting and doing nothing for a little bit will start to make the music, if you can even call it that, much louder and more distorted. It keeps getting worse until it stops entirely, and everything except for Mickey disappears. Now looking straight on, he laughs and asks if we want to see his head come off, jump scaring us before long. Just like many other things in this series, it's something that is heavily referenced and repeated throughout many official games and even some fan projects. Loading into the office, and we get a phone call, if you can even hear it over this loud ambience. The person calling us is Greg, who gives us a healthy portion of context as he apologizes for making us, an intern, watch over the island while he and the others are in Alabama, still getting their equipment sorted out before heading over to the island. Greg tells us that because this organization that we work for is trying to be professional, we actually have to act the part, as there are costumes that get up and walk around. The costume Greg is referring to is Photonegative Mickey, the most iconic character of the series and the face of both the fan game and creepypasta. It can't see anything, but does have good hearing, so if we were to wander into our office, we need to shut off a camera in a different room. This would make a loud enough sound and lead it out. Greg finishes off the call trusting us that we can handle ourselves for the rest of the night. And that right there is the general premise of FNATI. We're an intern working for a larger organization, and we have to watch over the island as it slowly comes to life. This will all make much more sense and be revealed much better with remakes and other content, but for the time being, that is FNATI at its most simple. As Greg alluded to over the phone, Photonegative Mickey will wander around this first night and occasionally get into your office. Shutting off a camera is the only way to get rid of him. When you shut off a camera by pressing space, it expectedly disables the camera for a minute or two. This means that it's useless until it turns back on. There isn't another way to turn it back on or make it come back faster, it's just gone. It's pretty much the series' most iconic gameplay mechanic, in line with FNAF 1's doors. For this demo at least, there really isn't another mechanic. With the second night and the introduction of a few other characters, they're dealt with in the exact same way. Speaking of, if we make it to the second night, we get another phone call. Surprisingly, it's from a new voice, Lisa, who also gives us a good amount of exposition. The person we're playing as is Jake, the intern. Lisa says that pretty much everything Greg said to us last night was stupid. They're still getting equipment ready, and we're just over here now to collect data, so it'll be easier for when everyone else comes over. She also mentions that Photonegative Mickey can actually see, just not very well. It doesn't really add anything new, but I guess it was to reinforce that you're supposed to actually, do something. There's also a new character that can wander around, Oswald. He's apparently an unfinished costume, and he was never colored, so he's apparently super dark and blends into everything. Sort of. Oswald will also occasionally walk into the office, and it's the same process for dealing with him as it is PNM. There is another threat in the second night that isn't at all mentioned by Lisa. This is the introduction of Disembodied, the head of a Donald Duck costume. In every rendition of FNATI, Disembodied is a non-lethal character, meaning that whenever he attacks, it's just to inconvenience you. In this game, and most of the others, Disembodied will spawn on the desk in front of you and make a loud noise. I'm unsure if it's supposed to make the other characters more aggressive, but I'm sure that was the intent since everyone is triggered by sound. But since all the AIs in this version are so random, it's hard to tell. Anyway, Disembodied can be warded off by shutting off a camera. Those are all the new introductions for the second night, so I'm going to briefly use this opportunity to talk about the way this game feels to play. I know I said I would avoid the repetitive, it's not that good discussion, but it really feels worse to play than how it looks. For starters, the game is in 4x3, which I know was standard for the first few FNAF games, but even in 2014 is a little weird. The game is seemingly in 16:9, but all the graphics are on 4x3 because even on the borders does the game respond, which is mostly noticeable when looking around the office. The camera flip, I think, responds to every frame the mouse is over the hitbox, so if you move your mouse at an odd speed, it'll double flip, which is very annoying. especially if someone's in the office. It just generally feels clunky. I believe this was Anart's first game, which, if it is still really good. This version of FNATI was made in Game Maker Studio, which is different from the usual Click team that FNAF was made in. You may see the game engine of choice switch a lot throughout its history, but the two main engines of choice were always Game Maker Studio and Click team. That's really all there is to say about the classic FNATI. There is supposedly more to this game, like an extended demo with a Night 3 and 4 and a section in between, but I never found it or ever got that far. Like, there's videos of it, but I can't necessarily confirm if this was ever official or not. It doesn't matter though, because we'll talk about FNATI Classic again in a future section. This was the very first version of the game, and is what kickstarted the craze of the Treasure Island games. Even now, it's crazy to think how an idea this simple started all of this. Like, we have so many games still to cover. So after the release of Classic, FNATI kind of blew up. I talked about it a little earlier, but the main reason for FNATI's success in its infancy was because of Markiplier and the other creators who made videos playing the game. Taking a look at just Mark for a second, his 2 videos on the game combined have a little more than 14 million views. It's actually kind of insane to think about. Anyway, because of FNATI's seemingly overnight success, Anart was pretty overwhelmed by the support and also a little upset that the game wasn't to the quality that he'd like it to be, especially since so many eyes were on it now. Anart would take the time over the following weeks to work on fixing the game to a much more polished state. But before all of that, in early January on the 12th, he would release a teaser game, TBMHC, which is the abbreviation for The Button Machine Hides Codes. Teaser games, especially FNATI teaser games, would be a staple in the coming years as a way of showing off new content. Think of it as if Scott Cawthon compiled all the teasers he would have generally put on Scott Games, and instead packaged them all into a single game file, and with clues around the game you could unlock each teaser. The Button Machine Hides Codes is a relatively small game, so upon booting it up you're met with a small interface of 5 red buttons, and on the far right side, 3 numbers, all 0. Occasionally, you'll quickly notice some numbers flash on screen for a moment. These are important to the game, so it's easier to use a screen recorder and slow the footage down. That is, if you were playing along 10 years ago, but I'm not, and thankfully all the codes were on the wiki. The way the game is supposed to work is by entering 3 numbers on the keyboard and pressing the corresponding red button. The buttons are labeled 1 through 5 going from left to right. Once a correct combination is entered, the teaser would be shown on screen, and you'd do this for all the numbers you found. The teasers in which Anart chose for his game would either be images shown off small portions of development, like a screenshot of assets being made, small looks at a character or environments, and even some voice lines. I didn't find very many videos of people playing it though, besides Risk Grim, who covered like literally everything Treasure Island during the earlier times. So it's safe to say that Anart didn't exactly catch the lightning in a bottle that he once had with the original demo. I mean, it's okay, this is only a teaser game after all. Because not long after, on January 26th, he would release the first demo to a remastered version of FNATI. This would go on to be referred to as 1.0. Every different remaster of FNATI following this one would have its own version of sorts. That's just the way the community has categorized everything, because there would be a ton of remasters and reworks of the original game. So now, after Anart gave his idea a little bit more time in the oven, here was the start of the new official Treasure Island. I'm gonna be very honest with you for a moment. I believe that this version of FNATI is infinitely worse than the classic build. For starters, the classic version already had a leg up on this version since it actually worked. I usually try to complete every game I talk about in its fullest, since personally I feel like you're infinitely more credible if you've actually, played the thing entirely, but I could not for the life of me beat even the first night of this. I have no clue what it is, but this game just does not work, like at all. I tried shutting off a camera when PNM entered, but I still died. I have no clue how Anart did it, if he at all playtested or if there's something I'm not getting. It's just very frustrating to see. However, a couple of days later, on February 1st, Anart would release the second teaser game, TGSEE, or This Gives Some Extra Enlightenment. The game was presumably made for the full release of 1.0, whenever that was supposed to happen. Anyway, the codes reveal some new characters as well as a new environment, the Pirate Caverns. The Pirate Caverns would become a staple in the FNATI franchise, being a common place to return to after night segments. There's also a teaser for another creepypasta to be added, Suicide Mouse. This in a way started the theme of FNATI being more so a celebration of all types of different creepypastas. This will become much more apparent later on in the series. Moving forward into June of 2015, and versions 2.0 and 3.0 would be released on the same day, both as demos. We need to take a step back for a moment, because in April, Anart would bring on 2 contributors to help create a version 2.0 of FNATI, to fix a lot of the bugs and issues that came with remaking an entire game from scratch. He chose to bring on Stella Wisps, who at the time went as Subwoofer X3, and the Purity Sinners. There isn't a whole lot known about the Purity Sinners, if it's just one person or a small development team, but I've heard that it was likely just one person, with a couple of other people being added later on. Anyways, back to April. The small team would create version 2.0, which would improve on graphics and gameplay tremendously. This is where version 2.0 stands today. The Purity Sinners, however, kept adding on to the story, which was now getting too complicated. This would lead Anart to lose motivation in the project, and he would see himself out shortly. Stella would presumably leave around this time as well. Before Anart left the project, he gave the rights over FNATI to the Purity Sinners so they could create the game they'd envisioned. Some of the major changes made to 3.0 were the removal of photonegative Mickey, who would be replaced by Willy, in reference to the Steamboat Willie cartoon. Photonegative Minnie would be replaced by Impure Mouse, who would be a normal color Minnie Mouse. There would be another massive graphical overhaul, which essentially just retextured a lot of the assets, primarily Oswald, who no longer blended into the environment behind him. The first instances of lore were pushed in YouTube video form, called transmissions. However, they're now considered lost media. There were also rumors of a boss fight, with some community members recalling it had something to do with the face. This version would be cancelled for a number of reasons, including a feud between the Purity Sinners and abandoned by Disney creator Slimebeast. For reasons we'll get into shortly, the Purity Sinners had heavy ambition for their Treasure Island games, but were moving way too fast and too far away from what made the original demos so successful in the first place. In August of 2016, the Purity Sinners announced a new project. Their official sequel to Five Nights at Treasure Island, titled Oblitus Casa. The name would be a Latin translation of Forgotten House, which was the theme planned for it. The Purity Sinners' planned catalog of games is a rabbit hole within a rabbit hole, but Oblitus Casa would have been in relation to Project DI, which was a cancelled Unreal Engine horror game from them. It was essentially FNATI, but free roam and removed all the FNAF elements. Project DI and Oblitus Casa would not see their end in the FNATI community here, as they'd later be repurposed into the official versions of Oblitus Casa in about 7 years from this point. Not much information would surface from the 2015 version and would be cancelled near immediately. I'm Scared NBD is a cancelled FNATI fan game by Stella Wisps that has very little inspiration from FNATI, but instead, I'm Scared. I'm Scared was a pretty big indie horror game around late 2015 into early 2016. I know nothing about it, short of its style, which is okay, because that's literally all I'm Scared NBD is, a tech demo with that style. Stella would tease the game in a video on their channel titled 001 in May of 2016. This video shows the bare-bones environment and is just made to show off what the game would be. The video does feature a threat that will start to chase you, but they're blurred out and it's hard to see who this is. The game would go on to be cancelled sometime after September 2016. Nothing was heard of the game since. That is until December 1st, 2023, when they released an early build of the game before it was cancelled. At least I would assume before its cancellation. There seems to have been a massive graphical overhaul, especially to the environment. It's no longer all gray and the floors and walls have texture now. Once you open the game, you're immediately thrown into this dark environment with wooden floors and gray walls. It's hard to see where we're going since the lighting is super dark. There really isn't much to do though besides wandering around the map. There is one active threat, Inkblot Oswald, who can't really kill you, but he can just follow you around. What we know of the gameplay is that you would have to traverse this maze collecting Mickey heads around the map to complete the level. I'm unsure of how many levels or Mickey heads there would be though. All things considered, I'm Scared NBD, while not really anything super impactful, was at least an interesting enough piece of FNATI history, especially considering it was supposed to have as much relevance as the other games. In early September 2016, Stella Wisps would create her own teaser game titled The Vault Hides the Key, or TVHTK for short. The game wasn't any larger than any previous teaser games, but it was meant to provide some exposition for two projects. Version 4.0 of FNATI and her own original project, Nightmare Before Disney. NBD, as it's commonly referred to, was supposed to release in 2015 as a spin-off of FNATI, but instead would be cancelled for various reasons. Now with the creation and continued progress of version 4.0, Stella could use NBD to tie into 4.0. There aren't any teaser images that can be unlocked in the application, but there are primarily logs, both for things we know would have been addressed in 4.0 and NBD. A day after TBHTK released on September 9th, Nightmare Before Disney would officially release. While the game would be created by Stella, there was assistance provided by Blackout 1912, or as they go by now as Nietzsche, the same person who would go on to create Dormitibus and also be later exposed for tons of things that I do not want to get into. If that name makes you uncomfortable, don't worry too much because their only contributions to FNATI were NBD version 4.0 and the very brief 4.5. They would leave to do their own things after a while. Nightmare Before Disney was an official FNATI spin-off. It takes place in this nightmare realm of sorts, where you need to fight off the toons that still lurk the building by using the cameras, blinking, and keeping your heart rate at a steady pace. There are a lot of really cool gameplay ideas that were implemented into this game, my favorite being the way of dealing with Inkblot or Tenzia. She'll occasionally leave her camera and spawn in a random camera, which is marked on your minimap. Once you click on said camera, her eyes will change color, and you need to click on the corresponding button in the top of your camera panel. This cycle repeats a few times before she goes back to her camera. The other gameplay is essentially the same as other FNATI games, where most threats are dealt with by blinking instead of shutting off a camera. All things considered, the game would be received fairly well by the community, and the team would return to work on version 4.0. But before all that, there's another game I want to very briefly talk about. Five Nights at Treasure Island Sister Location is a troll game created by Team Radiance and released alongside FNAF Sister Location back in October 2016, a month after NBD's release in September. This is a little weird to me because Radiance wasn't super prevalent in 2016 and wouldn't go on to make their impact in the FNATI community until a couple years down the line. They were starting to work on their own FNATI fan game, which kind of ties into this game, but we'll talk about that a little later once Radiance really starts to take off. Opening the game and loading into the main menu, there's a new character. We're not going to address him until a little later. You're just gonna just trust me on this one. Clicking new game and yeah, it's a troll. Big shocker. All we have to do is press G on the keyboard to make Bambi jump. That's literally the entire game. We're moving on. The last thing the FNATI community would see in 2016 was another teaser game created by Stella and Nietzsche. It's essentially just a remastered version of the Button Machine Hides codes. However, 12 teasers would be shown in this application, including 7 renders, a view of the map of the main building, as well as pirate caverns, and 3 logs. It seemed to most that version 4.0 had strong potential. This was all good news for the community, but in January of 2017, Stella would leave the project entirely, leaving everything she had worked on to Nietzsche, who would attempt to finish the game on their own. The Nietzsche version is commonly referred to as version 4.5, which also didn't see the light of day. While there isn't anything actually playable, we do have quite a bit of information on what would have been new in 4.0. We know that the basis would have been version 3.0 by the Purity Sinners. However, once again, the main antagonist would be changed from Willy to Mick, a demented-looking Mickey Mouse. They chose to stick with version 3.0 because secretly the Purity Sinners would be assisting Stella and Nietzsche, but this was never confirmed. Allegedly, 4.0 and 4.5 were extremely rushed, with production beginning before the duo had even the slightest clue where the game would go. Night 5 was supposed to be a special night of sorts, with the Inkblot toons from NBD being the only threats. There was an incredibly rushed story, including 2 endings, one similar to the ending of 6.0, which, don't worry, we'll get to, and another where the player ends up in the NBD office to survive against another new character named Inhuman. But I think my favorite fact from this era is that since Stella and Nietzsche had the supposed rights to FNATI, Nietzsche tried to stop fans from creating their own FNATI fan games, which obviously backfired. This whole era of FNATI history was pretty insane for only lasting a couple of months. Around mid-2017, Anart of all people would make his return to the series to create version 5.0, which was supposed to be the definitive version of FNATI, the way he had envisioned it in 2014. For 5.0, the game was back in its own roots, being heavily inspired by Abandoned by Disney and Five Nights at Freddy's. Because of this, none of the changes from version 2.0 onward were carried over to 5.0. However, Anart made some changes of his own. Photonegative Mickey was back and in the spotlight as the primary antagonist. However, he had another form called Paul. Paul was a photonegative Mickey Mouse costume, presumably with a human inside. Very reminiscent of the original creepypasta. Anart released a demo at the end of October 2017, showcasing the very early concept, which featured updated models and renders of the environments from version 2.0. However, Anart had some issues, not only with his dwindling motivation, but Game Maker Studio, his engine of choice, wasn't working how he'd liked it to, resulting in the game's cancellation. This is where things get a little confusing. Nietzsche, who was still around, just not super active in the FNATI space, was super unhappy with Anart's version of 5.0 and attempted to once again take things into their own hands by creating their own version of 5.0, which would be referred to as version 5.5 or God is Dead. The suits would be changed to toons once again, cameras would be removed from some locations, and best of all, they completely spit on the story that Anart had been working on fixing. Their whole new story is that there were gas leaks on the island that would lead to Jake's hallucinations. There wasn't much done with version 5.5 before its eventual cancellation, but it's assumed that Malrat made an office for Nietzsche, which is funny because Nietzsche flat out despised Malrat's FNATI fan games, the lost ones. Like, Nietzsche alone has an insane history. Just reading up on them, I can't understand how no one called them out on their bullshit before all of this. Or maybe they did, I haven't found it. It is crazy to me that they were able to be a part of the community for so long. Anyway, after the game's eventual cancellation, we start a new era in FNATI history. Around mid-2018, a small group of developers headed by Nocturna asked Nietzsche for ownership over Five Nights at Treasure Island, in hopes they'd be able to produce a definitive remake of the game. Nietzsche accepted, and the rights to FNATI were handed over to the developers. They worked under the name of Team Radiance, which should sound very familiar to most in the community, as their contributions have extended far beyond what they would go on to do for FNATI. Radiance had already begun work on their own interpretation of a remake of FNATI, temporarily going under the name Five Nights at Treasure Island Rebirth. This would later be changed back to Five Nights at Treasure Island before long. This remake the team had been working on had a lot done, but would be scrapped around the time of them gaining unofficial ownership of the series. Radiance's first attempt at a remake would go on to be heavily repurposed in both the 6.0 version of FNATI and the official version of Oblitus Casa. However, what I believe to be more interesting than another remake is Radiance's take on Oblitus Casa, their first attempt before the version we know today. There still wasn't much known about the original Oblitus Casa by the Purity Sinners, so everything going forward would be Radiance's interpretation of what the game would have been like. A couple of things did say the same from the original version, like the cabin theme and the Treasure Island characters. Radiance would go on to add a couple additional characters for this version, including their version of Willy, named Walgo. There's a normal version of Mickey Mouse named Technicolor Mickey, and an unknown, seemingly pair of characters named the Twins. There was also supposed to be another new character named Cactus Kid, who you may remember because their name is on the poster in the office of the original FNATI. This poster has been referenced in seemingly every build of the game, and even some of the later games going forward. It's cool to see this seemingly irrelevant prop be given some importance, especially since it's always been there. As for the rest of the cast, a lot of the characters from Treasure Island had been removed, leaving only photo-negative Mickey, the Face, Disembodied, and Goofy remaining. While there isn't much known about the 2018 version of Oblitus Casa, we have a couple early renders of some of the characters, including the new Walgo and Technicolor Mickey. But other than that, Oblitus Casa 2018 suffered the same fate as 2015, being cancelled seemingly very early into development. Most of the ideas in this version would then be repurposed to Radiance's later remake. Shortly after the cancellation of Treasure Island Rebirth and Oblitus Casa 2018, Radiance team created their first of many joke games titled Red Oddities. While it's true that it was initially intended to be taken seriously, that later changed for whatever reason. I think it was partially because Radiance wanted to remake Five Nights at Red Island. However, I think doubling down on Red Oddities being a joke was a good move, because if it was another Treasure Island game that tried to add on to the already annoyingly complicated lore, it most likely would have complicated the later remakes and future projects. So we're left with this oddly enticing joke game that was allegedly Radiance's last fan game. I say that with heavy quotes because I'm sure we all know how that turned out. Red Oddities was made seemingly quickly and was released in late 2018 on November 17th. So with a lot of hype to live up to, let's check out one of Radiance's first contributions to FNATI. Right away, there's a lot to unpack here. So first off, what you're looking at is red. Photo-negative Mickey, but the blue parts of his design are red. Hence the name. Even in 2018, Radiance was making huge creative strides. Hitting the new game button and loading into the office, there's even more to unpack here. If you needed any more proof that this game was a joke, seemingly the flumpty poster on the wall will convince you. There's also a puppet mask, the Treasure Island sign, and even a gold badge reading Red Oddities Museum. In the office, there are two doors to your left and right, each equipped with a door light, a camera system, and a FNAF 2 styled mask. Opening the cameras presents you with a 5.0 level interface. 4 nondescript buttons to some of the rooms in the building. Camera 1 is a dull room with 2 characters, Red and a white Goofy. Camera 2 features the original 3 FNAF animatronics, Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica, in their only appearance ever. I can't lie, seeing them here in a FNATI game of all places was a little jarring because they do not fit in with the style at all. It reminds me a lot of The Return to Freddy's in the sense that it's just a collage of random characters. Cameras 3 and 4 are the hallways right outside your door, so these are the main cameras you'll be looking at during the night. There is a phone call on the first night, the only one of the entire game. The phone guy, who goes unnamed in the game, mentions how you're just watching over the building and some of the company's property while they finish renovations or something. It's never mentioned who this company is or explicitly where we are though. The phone guy gives us the typical reasoning for a night guard, that being looking out for robberies and intruders. He then brings up the fact that the characters have a chance to move around and how we need to deal with them. For both Red and the White Goofy, we need to shut off a camera when one of them is at the door. For Bonnie and Chica, we need to put on the mask. And for Freddy, keeping the door lights on will get rid of him. After some more encouragement from the phone guy, he hangs up and leaves us on our own for the rest of the game. I believe that all characters can move on the first night, but I only saw Red, Bonnie, and Freddy move on my playthrough. The White Goofy, who was never given a name in the game, can also move, but I never saw that. Doing some research to figure that out, I found out that he does actually have a name. I'll give you about 3 guesses as to what the creatives over at Radiance came up with. Naturally, his name is Shitass, and he serves no greater purpose to the story than being a shitass. It feels weird, but I literally have nothing else to say on Red Oddities. There are 5 nights with a slight increase in difficulty after each one, but not enough where it gets really interesting to talk about. On top of that, once you beat the game, you get a PNG or whatever this is. While Red Oddities is a joke, I feel like there was supposed to be something more here. I don't know, it's weird because the next 2 Oddities games, while obviously still jokes, I feel that I have more to say about it. Speaking of, let's talk about Green Oddities. Some time passed since the release of Red Oddities, and Radiance went back to work on various projects, all of which were unrelated to FNATI. In late April 2019, Radiance announced their official remake of Five Nights at Treasure Island, the same game that would go on to be FNATI 2020. With their newfound purpose of remaking Treasure Island, Radiance would pretty much devote themselves entirely to making FNATI-related media, including a sequel to Red Oddities, called Green Oddities. From what I know, the game shadow dropped on July 1st and was shortly taken down. There hasn't been any talk of the game since its launch, and it's unsure how long it was even up for. I did find a copy on the FNATI wiki to play today though. Launching the game immediately throws us into one of the greatest looking menus I've ever seen. The title, Green Oddity Simulator, at the top, and below that, an orbiting new game button. On the other side of the menu, green, a new character can be seen coming into view. From this menu alone, you can tell that Radiance really stepped up the quality since Red Oddities. We finally have a soundtrack. Okay, so big surprise, this is one of Radiance's first troll games. Unlike Red Oddities, which is mostly unserious, this is the first time Radiance published a game as one thing, and the game itself would be completely different. The team would go on to do this a couple more times, which, of course, we'll talk about each of them later. In the actual game, after an amazing Night 2 title card, we load into this map area where we're playing as Green. There's a pretty distinct outline of where we need to go, but even still, there just isn't a hitbox keeping us in the light gray area. So really, you can just go about anywhere until you stumble into where you're meant to go. You'll eventually get to a room with a stock photo of a night guard, and as soon as you approach them, you kill them. That's literally it. That's the entire game. You know, it's times like these where I have to sit through and play dozens of shovelware-esque games that I really start to question what I'm doing with my life. But that's okay, because in August of 2019, a couple months after Radiance started FNATI 2020, which was called FNATI 2019 at the time, the team would actually release something. The amount of support they were getting at the time was unlike anything they had previously seen. So to celebrate it, they made their own teaser game, very similarly styled to The Button Machine Hides Codes, this one titled TSYKIAL. Doesn't really have a name, or at least one that I could find easily. The best guess people have for it is "The secrets you know is a lie," which sounds convincing enough, so we'll go with that. Opening the application presents us with a warning of sorts. It tells us that what we're about to play is a teaser game. It also asks the player not to decompile the game and just play along by entering the codes ourselves, which is fair enough. I'm not sure if that was an issue with the earlier teaser games similar to this, but it makes sense, since all the teasers in this game are just images and audio files. But agreeing and pressing onward brings us to the actual game. We're standing in front of 4 buttons. Clicking on any of them will turn them green and play a sound. We can turn around where we'll find 3 more buttons, each of them labeled with a color, either red, blue, or green. Occasionally on screen some codes will flicker in for a second. Just like all the games before this one, it's easier to use a screen recorder and slow the footage down to see the codes. The codes in this game all follow the same formula. 5 numbers, 1 through 4, one of 3 letters, R, G, and B, and a number. By now, I'm sure you already know what's coming. Enter the first 5 numbers on the set of 4 buttons, turn around and enter the color, and press the number on your keyboard. While there aren't that many teasers this time around, what is shown is pretty substantial. We have renders of completed rooms and characters, a couple teasers of Easter eggs, a wireframe view of the map, and some logs. The logs are pretty interesting as they detail some of the characters we know from the earlier versions of FNATI first arriving to the island. They even mention their original deals with Disney and how everything they've been told has seemed off. We even get some additional context to why everyone was so interested in Treasure Island in the first place. Something about a group of people showing up to the island only to never be seen again. What we get from TSYKIAL is pretty substantial, and it makes sense why we wouldn't hear much from Radiance as the next year went by. They worked on a couple things here and there, and maybe dropped a teaser or work in progress screenshot occasionally, but that was the bulk of 6.0 teasing the community would get for a while. A lot of time had passed since Radiance had released anything. They were still updating the FNATI community via GameJolt with frequent updates in progress. 6.0 was coming along at a somewhat steady pace, and by mid-2020 they had most of the game finished. That was until they released Blue Oddities, the final chapter. The game was made by Peyton, Mr. Manatee, who was one of the founders of Radiance. Peyton was also Radiance's lead programmer for a while, helping create 6.0 and Chuck E. Cheese's Rebooted. However, while all of Radiance's games are made by multiple people under Radiance, this was pretty much all Peyton, with some small help from other members. I'm only mentioning this because Blue Oddities was officially released by Radiance, and it's hopefully a little easier to understand that this is who the game was made by. From my looking around, it seems as if Blue Oddities was shadow dropped in June 2020, meaning that there was virtually no teasing or any announcement of its existence before it was already out. So all we have is this file. The game opens with whatever this is. We're playing as Blue, a new character in Blue Oddities, and we have to smack Peyton's head and gain points. I'm just gonna let this play out.
Bruh. He needs some milk!
If we do what the instructions told us before the game crashed and restart the game, we load into the actual game. Already a much better start than Green Oddities. Blue Oddities is a one-night sit-and-survive game that has a lot more going for it than you'd think an Oddities game should. Starting the game, and we're in this weird office, in a good amount of darkness. On the desk, there's some Easter eggs like Birthday Boy Blam and the head of Nightmare Oswald from the 2015 version of NBD. There's also a monitor with a list of tasks, but this will be explained in a moment. We get a call from someone who seems panicked. The phone guy calls us and explains that he doesn't have much time. We've been lured into this warehouse to play a simple game. We have to complete all the tasks on the screen before 6 AM. Just like most FNAF games, we are given a tablet that is connected to cameras in each of the rooms, as well as some other features. They're all listed on the side here, so let's just go in order. There's Reboot, which isn't really used for anything outside of the task to reboot the monitor. It just makes it so you can't use the monitor for a little bit of time. There's a Room Shutdown feature, which will temporarily trap whatever is in the room we shut down for a little while. And finally, we have the power, which can very easily be recharged or drained. I never actually figured out what happens when the power reaches 0, because it's just so easy to recharge it. In addition to the tablet, you're also given a flashlight, which can be used in 3 spots in the office: left, right, and middle. There are 4 threats that we have to look out for. The first of which is Blue, who will wander around the warehouse until he ends up at one of your 2 sides. When we see him, we need to quickly run to the opposite side. When we get to either of the 2 safe rooms, we'll need to quickly turn and increase the countdown counter to ensure that Blue has enough time to go away. When this timer reaches 0, the room will unlock. Unlucky for us, while we wait, we have to play a small game. In the safe room on the right side, we have to shine a light on one of 5 possible entry points. We'll know which one to flash when a voice tells us. Failure to find the right entrance in time, and you're as good as dead. For the minigame on the left side, a hand will offer us a card. We have to memorize how many symbols are on each card and enter them as a code when prompted. You get 5 cards, so there's a 5-digit code. Getting this code wrong in any way will kill you. When either of these 2 minigames have been completed, you are safe and can turn back to the lockdown counter and get out. The second character is Yellow. He'll always be found in camera 11 as he slowly makes his way up the stairs into the entrance in front of you. If he's not in the camera, he either hasn't spawned in for the night or he is right in front of you, in which case you need to shine the flashlight on the middle entrance. This will reset him and the cycle repeats. Yellow is decently fast, but thankfully he won't make any progress if you turn and leave to go to one of the safe rooms in the event that Blue were to attack. The next 2 characters are really easy. Red, for example, has a chance of appearing on the monitor in front of you, where all you need to do is click on him and he'll go away. Green, the final character, is also really really easy, and he'll only appear and take away your flashlight and or tablet if you're using them too much. As for the actual gameplay of the night, we need to be completing the 5 tasks on the monitor in front of us. The first one is always to reboot the monitor, which you can do very easily while the phone guy is talking, since none of the characters are active yet. The second task involves finding 2 objects around the warehouse. There's 3 possible items that you could have to find: a star, a nail, or a rock. The star is usually the hardest out of the 3, blending pretty well into the UI on the monitor. The nail, I believe, can be found in one of the 2 safe rooms on the lockdown dial, so if you have that one, it's worth checking out or just waiting for Blue to attack. The rock can be found in one of the cameras, usually on the ground. I always found this one naturally while looking around, so it's not as big of a deal as the other 2. The third task involves trapping Blue in 2 specific cameras. This, I would assume, can be any camera, but will usually be 2 cameras on opposite sides of the map. The building can be split into 2 sections, the left and the right. When Blue spawns in, he'll be on either side, and usually stays on that side as he makes his way to the office. Unless you get really lucky and he crosses over at some point, you're better off just waiting for him to attack and trapping him the second time he wanders around, since at least from my experience, he always would start back up again on the opposite side. I've heard about an optimal way to get this task done, but it's primarily useful for the max mode. It just involves resetting if you have to trap Blue in a few specific cameras. There are some cameras that are more likely to get Blue to wander into. The fourth task is another easy one, requiring that you have your power at a certain percentage. You can do this after rebooting the monitor while the phone guy is still talking. The final task is the longest, and it requires you to listen to an entire song. You have to keep it playing whenever you have the monitor down, and it'll pause whenever you either flip the monitor up or leave for one of the safe rooms. The song is about 1.5 minutes, so it's important that you're playing it whenever there's some downtime. Once all the tasks have been completed, the monitor will light up with a green checkmark. A soft voice can be heard and it says the usual, "I can't believe you beat me" shtick. The voice says that we may have heard of red oddities, but he knows something we haven't seen. The lights turn on to reveal this thing as it slowly makes its way towards us. After doing whatever this is for a few seconds, the screen cuts to orange oddities. I'm assuming that thing we just saw was orange. Of course, it was all a joke and the credits roll. Back to the main menu, and there's now a custom night. It's decently packed with a lot of challenge presets, as well as the elusive all 100% max mode, which actually changes the gameplay loop a little bit as each character has a stricter timer that they operate under. I'm sure that's the case for the normal nights and other challenges as well, but at least from what I've seen, the room for error is much smaller. Beating all 100% does unlock a new ending. After completing all tasks, the same cutscene with Orange will start to play until it quickly ends with him jump scaring the player. After some static, it's revealed that Blue Oddities was all a dream. The person who had said dream is presumably Jake, and he wakes up to a phone call from someone congratulating him on getting the job. He tells Jake that his first assignment is a little strange, how they're in need of someone to watch over this island. While this cutscene is no longer canon, I remember thinking this was a pretty cool segue into Treasure Island, especially since we get a little exposition. As we'll come to find out in 6.0, a similar cutscene was made for the opening, albeit much more in line with the theme and tone of Treasure Island. And also being a lot more serious and not taking place in Blue Oddities of all places. But that's it for Blue Oddities. This was the one game I knew about in a gameplay sense even before starting this video or playing any of the other Treasure Island games. It's cool that I finally found a spot where I could talk about it, because for it being a smaller game, it does offer a lot. I also think that it strikes the perfect balance between being a joke and not feeling like a letdown. Of course, Radiance would go on to make a couple more joke games, both of which we'll talk about later on. And while I think in some aspects they are much better than Blue Oddities, I think it's entirely possible that they wouldn't have been as fleshed out without this game. This would be Radiance's final project before finally releasing 6.0. But before that, we do have one final cancelled project to talk about. Chaos at Treasure Island is more so known as FNATI Ultimate Custom Night. It was meant to be an official entry in the series, but as a non-canon trequel. If you remember when I talked about Project Readjusted last year, you may remember that it also had its own UCN of sorts, and this is pretty much that. There are a ton of parallels between the elevator build of Project Readjusted 3 and Chaos at Treasure Island. Because this was scrapped pretty quickly into development, there isn't a whole lot to go over. However, Radiance did release a thread going over their plans for the game, so I'll use this section to go over those plans. Chaos at Treasure Island was meant to be a less serious official FNATI 3, and the idea of it all was super ambitious. Radiance thought it would be best for a game with a less serious tone to be taken less seriously, so they leaned heavily into jokes for their mechanics. At first, there were to be 4 maps that were on the camera monitor, which would result in over 20 different cameras. Plans down the line made it so the office would be in an elevator and you could travel up and down between 2 floors and deal with threats that way. This was the version of Caddy that got the farthest, and Radiance thought it might be a good idea to recruit a ton of different FNATI developers throughout the community to help contribute their own camera renders and characters. There were even plans to collaborate with Malrat and his own Treasure Island fan game series that he had been building up for as long as the official series. There was a decent amount of work done, including some renders, concepts, sound effects, and art. Ultimately, the project was canned because of its ambition, and it's safe to say that Radiance then poured their energy into the actual FNATI projects instead. Speaking of... if you remember back around the time in between Red and Green Oddities, which would be around late April of 2019, Radiance would announce they would officially be returning to Treasure Island to make the definitive version of the game under the codenames of Treasure Island 2019 and 6.0. With the announcement of their remake, they had also received extra approval from Slimebeast, the creator of the original creepypasta. Treasure Island 6.0 had a lengthy development process from when it started back in 2019 to what released at the end of 2020. A lot had happened in the time between those two dates, including, but not limited to, a leaked build making its rounds throughout the community in around January 2020, the Radiance team expanded dramatically, bringing on a lot of new faces to the project. I'm sure we all know what happened in March of 2020, and the team used this break to make a lot of substantial progress. They would then delay the game a ton and release Blue Oddities in June. We're looking at a potential October release, but delayed once again to its final release on November 28th. While Radiance doesn't necessarily look back on 6.0 very fondly, in my eyes it's still impressive. So now that we've finally arrived at the latest version of Treasure Island, let's take a deeper look at the game and the story it was trying to tell. Yeah, I am aware that this is still pretty much like every other version we've played before this one. I went into this thinking it was the definitive Treasure Island experience, so we're gonna go into a little more detail and reintroduce everything from the characters to the environments as if we haven't seen them before. A lot of it does overlap from earlier versions, but I also think that it's important that we do this now so we don't confuse certain plot points and other things when talking about Oblitus Casa. The game opens on a cutscene of a voicemail. It's Greg from the Supernatural Studies Association. He's calling to inform us of an open position at an abandoned island him and his team are currently investigating. All we have to do is look after the place and collect some data while he gets things ready over at base. Greg finishes the call on a lighter note than usual, stating that it's an easy way to get credits, which, if you remember from the original, is exactly what Greg didn't want us to think. The cutscene finishes with what seems to be a view into the island from a pier outside, a gap in the fence visible, potentially hinting that even the SSA is not supposed to be here. After that, we're booted straight into the main menu, a super dark one at that. It's also interesting to note that it seems to be slowly moving away from the typical Five Nights branding that the series had built up, only the Treasure Island logo being present on the menu. The menu theme itself is a massive departure from the previous versions, no music or theme, just this harsh ambience. Of course, what FNATI game would be complete without a shaky photo-negative Mickey? Apart from that, there really isn't a whole lot else on the main menu. There's an options menu with a fair amount of accessibility features like customizable subtitles and even a face cam mode which rearranges parts of the UI. With really nothing else to do, we start our first night at Treasure Island. Just like the games before it, 6.0 starts off the main gameplay with a wall of text that tells us the different keybinds for basic functions. It also hints at some of the main gameplay like pressing space to shut off a camera, shift and control to turn off the lights in the office, and stand still. In comparison to some of the earlier versions, it's not a lot to remember, but I can't lie, in some of the later nights it had me scrambling for a second because I would forget a keybind. I think it would have been better if the only hint it gave was for the mechanics for that night, just to avoid confusion. I'll get into why a little bit later, but for right now we're getting a phone call. Just like the many versions before, the call on the first night is from Greg. In typical fashion, he thanks us again for taking the position, even if we're only an intern. A lot of what he says in this call is reminiscent of the earlier versions, so to be brief, he's still at base and is waiting for the equipment to be shipped over to the island. Greg mentions that we've probably heard the rumors about the place, and to sort of ease our mind, he tells us that he's not allowed to confirm or deny any findings, so he's about as helpful as ever. He mentions something about the team finding something suspicious with the costumes, and tells us about an inverted Mickey. This, of course, being photo-negative Mickey, is said to have a weak vision and will occasionally be seen wandering around. Just like before, if it does happen to walk into the office, all we need to do is shut off a camera, which will lure it out. Greg finishes the call on a pretty ambiguous note, not telling us any more. That's pretty much it. We're on our own for the first night with PNM wandering around. Just as Greg suggested, it'll occasionally walk into the office and is deterred by shutting down one of the cameras. You'll have about 4 seconds to do so, which is a lot less time than I thought it'd be at first. However, PNM isn't the main threat tonight. It's actually the power system that this abandoned building apparently has. It goes down really fast and doesn't allow you much time on the cameras. It can't at all be regenerated, but it can be turned off momentarily when the lights are off. This is the only real use for the lights at the moment, as there isn't a threat attached to them yet. The lights can't be kept off forever, as if they've been out for a decent amount of time, they'll break entirely and can't be turned back on. Something else I want to mention before we move on is that the office ambience in this game is incredible. It sort of blends into the background as the call goes on, and even into the first few hours of the night as you're watching the cameras. But the second you turn off the lights for the first time, everything stops and you realize just how quiet it can get. It definitely put me on edge for the first time, and is a really good way of building up the tension, even if some of the ambience remains in the back. Speaking of ambience, you'll occasionally hear a voice line from the costumes. It's still the usual weird shit like "wanna see my head come off," but it's way more distorted than before, which genuinely took a couple of times for me to get what it was being said. From what I can tell, when the sound is played, it doesn't really indicate anything, so I'd assume it's purely there for ambience. After we finish the first night in the usual 6 AM, another cutscene plays. This time we can move our head around as the scene fades in. We seem to be in a cellar sort of thing. What's actually going on here is never confirmed in-game. It's the nightmare of another character we're going to meet shortly. However, as of right now, not much actually happens. We hear some strange noises from outside the cellar, but before long, the scene gets bright before fading into the second night. In typical FNATI fashion, the phone call on the second night is from Lisa. She once again chastises Greg for leaving out some important details from the previous night's phone call. She starts off by correcting Greg's assumptions that the tunes aren't costumes, but they aren't actually sure what they are. Also, how Greg mentions that some of them can't see, when in reality most of them can, just not very well. She also gives some subtle foreshadowing that not everything can be dealt with via shutting off a camera, and instead suggests to hide. Again, not sure why this was mentioned now and not later, because we don't really need to hide at all. The main new threat tonight is just Oswald, and in a similar way to previous versions, is lured out of the office by the sound of a camera shutting off. She finishes off the call by warning us not to go anywhere near a certain area of the island called the Pirate Caverns. She doesn't tell us much about it before hanging up and leaving us on our own for the rest of the night. As she mentioned, Oswald is here tonight and he functions the exact same way as before, even standing in the same spot in the office when he enters. He thankfully isn't that hard to spot, but I suppose if you're looking around quickly and not giving too much attention to your surrounding area, I can see why he'd slip by pretty easily. However, what Lisa didn't mention is the second threat of the night, which if you remember from the earlier versions is Disembodied, the Donald head that makes a lot of noise. I genuinely hate Disembodied in this game for the sole reason that he is so unreasonably loud. My ears aren't even that sensitive, but every time he'd show up, it not only startled me, but usually left my ears ringing for a second. I probably should have just turned down my game, but for some reason I just didn't and just got used to it. Anyway, Disembodied is also deterred by shutting off a camera, but I'm sure you knew that. After finishing up the second night, we return to the same room from the cutscene the night before. It plays out mostly the same, except at the start we can hear this weird screaming before something runs by. The cutscene ends with a pair of eyes staring back at us. For the third night, we get a phone call from Henry, another SSA intern. He sounds desperate and worried and asks us for help. He had been there for a good amount of time before us and was stuck in Pirate Caverns. So it looks like after we're done here, we have to go rescue this guy. As for threats, there's 2 more. The first of which is Acephalus, the headless Goofy. When he enters the office, we need to stand still so he doesn't detect us. He's only one of 2 characters in the entire game to utilize the standing still mechanic, and honestly, I don't really have anything else to say about it. The second threat is Impurity, a twisted version of Minnie Mouse. Impurity is dealt with the exact same way as PNM and Oswald, by shutting off a camera. After finishing night 3, we enter the Pirate Caverns section of the game. Before this section starts, a tip on the screen tells us that if we see eyes, use the flash, and if there aren't any eyes, stand still. These mechanics are for the 2 characters we'll encounter in the Pirate Caverns: the Face, who has eyes, and Undying, who doesn't. The Pirate Caverns are a point-and-click, free-roam-ish environment where we need to look around and find something. We have a flashlight which can be used to see threats, and a camera to deal with the Face. The camera does have a limited battery and will drain quickly when used, but will slowly regenerate over time. I'm sure, as you'd expect, with each room we enter, we need to stop and look around for threats before moving forward. We eventually make our way to an office with a key in the desk drawer. We then need to backtrack to an elevator and take it down a floor to level 2. After a little bit of time, after the elevator music stops, we've arrived at a lower level of Pirate Caverns. Immediately, you can probably tell that it's much more run down than the level above, and is complete with its own much more ominous ambience. We make our way through these boardwalks in what looks to be a massive cave system. Somewhere along the path we'll encounter Undying, this human-like costume with a giant Mickey Mouse head and hollowed-out eyes. When we see him in front of us, we need to stand still. We eventually make it to the staff room where our key from earlier comes into use. As we enter the room, something isn't right. There's drawings of Mickey and the other toons, as well as scribbles about someone lying, and it's not safe. I genuinely love this room so much, and it's a shame that this is the only time that it's used in the series, at least so far. This is presumably where Henry was hanging out, and it's clear that he's 1, not here, and 2, gone insane. The 4th night starts before we can investigate any further. We don't get a phone call this time, instead we're all by our lonesome. There's one new character, the Face. He's the only character in the game that is repelled by the use of the lights. So if the Face were to get in, you'd need to quickly turn off the lights until he left. After the 4th night, we're back in the same place we were for the post-night cutscenes for nights 1 and 2. This time, the shadowy figure stares us down before disappearing. It then reappears directly in front of us before sending us into the 5th night. There's only one new character added tonight, that being Undying. He shares the same mechanic with Acephalus, where if he were to enter the office, you need to stand still until they left. He's pretty straightforward. After completing the night, another cutscene plays where Jake receives a phone call from Greg. He tells us that we are going to have to spend one more night on the island, as everyone isn't quite ready to head over to us just yet. A figure can be seen in the back as the cutscene ends. Here we are, everyone, what most consider to be the best and worst night in the entire game. So going into night 6, the toons on the island have fused and merged into this larger figure. This is Hourglass, all the toons merged into one monstrosity. Hourglass combines every single mechanic into one, and it's not explained very well. Before we talk about this, I have a confession. I knew Night 6 was going to be annoying, so I looked up a strategy to help me get through it as smoothly as possible. So I did some looking and found a decently replicable strategy for Hourglass. The way Hourglass works is that whatever camera he starts in is the mechanic that it will mimic. The issue with that is, there's zero incentive to check the cameras at all throughout the main game, so I and for sure many others just had no clue where each character started. So figuring out which mechanic he was going to copy was impossible. Thankfully, this is where the strategy comes in. If he starts in cameras 5 or 8, stand still once he enters. If he starts in camera 9, turn the office light off. And finally, if he's in 3 or 4, we need to turn off a camera. Those are the basics, and it's really easy to cycle quickly between these 5 cameras at the start of each cycle and just memorize what he's going to do. It's then just a matter of waiting before he gets to the office and the cycle repeats.
I forgot to mention this at the time, so peep the headset mic, but this can be simplified even further to just checking cam 3 and 4, and then just turning off the lights and standing still when he walks in.
This makes the Hourglass fight so much easier, and I beat it relatively quickly. So with night 6 out of the way, we head back to the Pirate Caverns one final time. We continue onto the elevator and to the 3rd floor, where we'll input the code we were given by Henry earlier into this vault, where it reveals a bunch of drawing equipment. The shadowy figure appears in front of us one final time before jumping in our face to end the game. A pretty abrupt and lame ending, if I'm being completely honest. And well, that's Five Nights at Treasure Island Remastered 6.0. There is a little more content in the game after this though, like a custom night with some custom-made exclusive characters and challenge presets. As a fun addition after beating the main game, Radiance added a Classic mode, a complete port of the classic version of FNATI that was released back in 2014. Classic mode is a replica of that demo, but entirely fleshed out and actually completed. There's 5 full nights in a Pirate Cavern section included where you have to survive against the Face for a minute. There's a full game here, and you can unlock 2 characters from the custom night just by completing it. Back to the custom night for a moment, because completing the final preset, True Nightmare, unlocks one final cutscene. It shows a vault with Project DI written on it. For a split second, some numbers appear on the screen before the cutscene ends. We'll talk a little bit more about the implications about this in a moment. But that's really about it for the latest version of Five Nights at Treasure Island. While most of the people on the Radiance team have grown to dislike this entry, I think it still holds up pretty well, even if the gameplay is ridiculously easy. I do think that a rework of some of the mechanics are in order because of the foolproof strategy that can be found and implemented right away and last literally the entire game besides the Hourglass fight. While I definitely don't hate the game, I think it could also benefit from a fresh coat of paint. But I can't lie, I was probably the most invested in this series with this game if we aren't including the future sequel, which I'll talk about soon. Shortly after everything with 6.0 was all said and done, Radiance would release another small game. TWGMS, or This Will Give Me Secrets, is a teaser game in which it takes the perspective of Greg accessing a computer at the SSA. What makes the game different from the other teaser games so far is that the codes are not directly found within the game itself. Instead, they are hidden around version 6.0. Inputting the codes unlocks many logs and additional renders from 6.0. But the 2 most important codes, found in the cutscene after completing True Nightmare Nightmare show the first look at Willy and the map layout for Oblitus Casa. Radiance was coming back to remaster that too. Just so we're all on the same page going forward, Radiance's Oblitus Casa is a direct sequel to Treasure Island 6.0. A couple days after TWGMS dropped, they released one more thing before they would start their work on the new Oblitus Casa. Five Nights at Treasure Island Anniversary Edition was made for the game's 6th anniversary, and it serves almost as another remake of Treasure Island, but in the graphical style of something like 4.0. It for sure is an improvement over that style and looks pretty grungy and old, which is an aesthetic that Radiance can pull off pretty well. Something pretty interesting that I didn't know until pretty much just now was that Anniversary Edition, while planned to be released for the 6th anniversary, was made way in advance and was actually finished up way before 6.0 was. It wasn't released until a little later into December of 2020 because the team didn't want the release of yet another FNATI game overshadowing their much bigger 6.0. Anniversary Edition was also seemingly made by a studio that wasn't Radiance, instead being made by Acid Rain. They would also be responsible for the original version of another game that Radiance would go on to remaster, Five Nights to Remember. Even more interesting is that Acid Rain is just an anagram for Radiance. I have no clue if that's even common knowledge, but at this point it should be more obvious. Anniversary Edition is more so a FNAF game than it is a FNATI game, if that at all makes sense. The game follows a more typical FNAF formula, where it's 5 nights, you get a paycheck in the end, and fired after custom night. As for the actual gameplay itself, it's literally just FNATI. There is a mechanic for hiding under the desk, however, which is a new addition. Pretty much the way it works is that when something were to enter and you didn't have a camera to shut off, or just weren't ready, you can hide and there's a 50-50 chance that you'll live. I'm pretty sure there's more to it, like one of the character's mechanics being directly tied to it, but I honestly cannot remember. That's kind of how much this game blended into the back of my mind for me, I'm sorry. One thing I will say about the gameplay that I do remember is that this is an absolute drag. Each night is 7 minutes long, which is the same length as a night in FNAF 2, which in that game doesn't necessarily feel boring because there's always something to do or to be looking at, but in this game, nothing happens. Characters move at seemingly random or pretty much non-functional speeds. None of the environments are necessarily that interesting compared to any other FNATI game. I remember specifically messing with the phone in the office, which has actual sound effects, which, come to think of it, makes me a little sad that this is the one thing I can remember about this. I know it sounds like all I'm doing is ripping on this game that honestly isn't even bad in retrospect, but this was one of the final games I played for this video, and I think I was mentally tuned out of everything FNATI at this point. But with that finally out of the way, Radiance would begin their work on FNATI 2, Oblitus Casa. They would minimize the amount of posting they'd do on their social media, until one day, nearly 8 months later, at the end of July 2021, they released a demo for the game. When launching, it looked pretty promising, even with a unique animated opening. That is, until halfway through, Willy glitches out to reveal Funtime PNM. I'm not telling you his real name yet, you're just gonna have to trust the process here. So yeah, this isn't an Oblitus Casa demo, it's another sister location game. However, this time there's an actual game attached to this one, it's not just a shitpost. Well, I mean it is, but it's at least pretty well made. Oblitus Casa Sister Location takes 2 minigames from FNAF Sister Location and remakes them using FNATI characters. I say that extremely loosely, it's literally just this guy. The first minigame is a complete remake of the Night 3 repair minigame from the original Sister Location. You have to press a certain amount of buttons on Funtime Mickey here until you can eventually get his innards and repair him. Just like the FNAF equivalent, Funtime Mickey has his own Bonbon, a puppet of Oswald, who also has a name, but you know, trust the process. It plays out exactly how it normally would, where you have to position your cursor around Mickey's torso until you can get Oswald to appear long enough where you can shut him off using a button on his chest. This minigame for sure wasn't anything too special, especially compared to the next one, but it does give a pretty good look at some of the detail on these models, and it's genuinely impressive. Funtime Mickey has a lot of scribbles and markings all over him too, and it's kind of fun looking around and trying to find Easter eggs and references. The second and easily best minigame is another remake, this time of the breaker room section. So first and foremost, we no longer have a danger meter, we have a swag meter, which is better in every way. Secondly, I'm sure the absolute first thought on your mind is whether or not Funtime Mickey over here has voice lines, since Funtime Freddy had them in Sister Location. And to that assumption, you'd be right. Funtime Mickey is voiced by none other than Coach Carter. All of his lines that are used in this game are from Pulp Fiction, which oddly kind of works in this incredibly out-of-context situation. What? Anyway, the minigame plays out exactly how it does in Sister Location. But once you complete it, it turns out that we weren't just powering the building, but instead a self-destruct sequence that's going to destroy everything in the building. As to be expected, everything blows up, followed by an end screen. There's also a small teaser of this box thing. So back on the main menu, and we finally get access to an extras menu. where we can finally see what the Funtime Mickey is actually called.
Animatronics D's! Nuts!
We're moving on, I don't care. How does one even start a section like this? After playing literally everything the FNATI series had to offer, Oblitus Casa stands far above it all in many ways. I have a lot to say about it. I'll start off by saying right now, playing Casa was the best experience I've had playing a FNAF-like game since my original playthrough of Project Readjusted 3, which, if you know anything about me or my content, was the game that got me back on board with FNAF. As I was playing Casa, I probably wouldn't say that, but after closing the game and letting it all sink in, I'm pretty confident in saying just how good this game was. In many ways, Oblitus Casa is a very natural step forward, not just for Radiance, but the FNATI series, and I guess the fandom as a whole. While on the surface, Casa still has its roots in FNAF, I don't think I would consider it a fan game that much. It's been increasingly more clear that Radiance is moving away from FNAF, which is fine. Five Nights at Treasure Island, while very obviously being restrained to the fact that it is a remake of a fan game, still tried its best to differentiate itself from FNAF while still being faithful to the source. Oblitus Casa takes it another step forward, not only by dropping pretty much any sense of branding related to FNAF aside from the UI, it's pretty much its own game now. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I would pay money for this. It feels wrong that this is a game you can play for free. There is so much love and care put into this game that it's genuinely hard to try and point out every little detail and reference to other mediums. And trust me, if I did, we'd be here all day. The fact that Radiance saw Casa 1.0, which was an already solid enough experience on its own, and decided that it needed more says a lot in itself, even if 2.0 was to fix bugs and not much else. But they didn't even stop there. It's a whole other game now. One that's genuinely far beyond what I think anyone was expecting it to be. I know this very long introduction to Casa segment is pretty much me glazing the game, but I guess it's me trying to understand how a game like this even exists, given everything we've looked at so far. Casa isn't perfect, I have some complaints here and there, but it's so hard to even factor those in when I think of Casa as a whole product. Alright, I'm gonna stop my ramble there and continue essentially where we left off. Shortly after 1.0 released in November 2022, Radiance would spend many weeks patching and locating bugs that people reported. And I mean, there were a ton of bugs. However, whenever they tried to fix one issue, it would create two more. It got so bad to the point that the team thought it would be easier to recode the entire game from scratch than to patch it in the current version. So, a couple days after launch on December 2nd, Radiance announced that they would be doing just that and recoding the entire game from scratch, in a new version they called 2.0. This version would see a different development team, a much smaller team at that. Since there was already a basis of what they wanted, keeping the team small to prevent issues, trading the files back and forth could actually be possible. Along with the announcement of 2.0, they announced it would be the definitive experience, with all the bells and whistles that 6.0 had and more. Development for 2.0 went mostly as planned, although Radiance was relatively silent on it. I remember hearing rumors of stuff they were adding from some inner circles, and I can't lie, some of the stuff people were saying were to be implemented into 2.0 legitimately sounded impossible. It took the 2.0 team a little over 10 months, but they had the definitive version of Oblitus Casa, the one that Radiance wanted people to play. I remember briefly talking to Nocturna around August, about a month before launch, and I said something along the lines of, I meant to go back and finish Casa, and the answer I would keep getting would be, wait for 2.0. And I mean, the 2.0 team said this to literally everyone. I can really see why now. The difference between 1.0 and 2.0 is night and day. But finally, at the end of September 2023, Radiance released 2.0.
Today is December 1st, 2004. This is Dr. Jared Rowley speaking, and my patient's name is Jake Smith. Jake Smith was declared missing in 2003 during the Discovery Island incident. A year later, on July 23rd, 2004, he was found and taken into custody after displaying signs of delusions and paranoia. Currently, he's a suspect in the disappearance of Greg McLaughlin, Lisa Birch, and Henry Miller. Now, Jake, can you tell me anything you recall from your time on Discovery Island? Maybe you'd like to talk about what exactly caused you to vanish like that, or where you were when you were missing. Don't you want to put all this behind you, Jake? You spent a year on that island. You lost a year of your life to it. 3 friends. Do you really want it to take even more? Thank you, Jake. Now please, tell me about the cabin.
I've always loved that opening. I couldn't pinpoint the exact thing about it, but every single time it's super exciting. So, as we just heard, we're still playing as Jake after the events of Treasure Island. It seems as if we've located some cabin on the island, and this is the place we're taking refuge in, to stay safe from Hourglass or Mother or whatever else is still lurking in the employee building. The cabin always struck me as a cool place for one of these games to take place in. I think it strikes the perfect balance of the home-like environment that works so well in FNAF 4, but also the weirdly uncanny feeling a lot of older, rundown restaurants have. It's a great set piece, and I'm glad it gets as much focus as it does. The last thing I'll say about the menu is how much I adore the focus on the cabin, and not what's in it. I've never really cared for the menus with the animatronics having a seizure occasionally. It works when it works, but most of the time it doesn't, and it looks a little goofy. Having a set piece, especially one with as much focus in the game as the cabin, I think was a good move, mixed with that really good menu theme as well. I know at this point I'm overanalyzing for the sake of it, but these details rarely get pointed out, so I might as well. One last thing I'll say before we move on to the actual game, you can actually change the menu background if you wish in the settings. You can change it to the background used in 1.0 or even the beta version. However, my absolute favorite feature of the menu is dragging in literally any photo. I didn't know about this until after I beat the game, and therefore didn't get any footage of it, but seriously try it. I did end up with a screenshot of one of my friend's face taking up the entire menu. With nothing else left to do, we start the first night. Once we've loaded into the office of sorts, it's important to figure out where we are in the building. Opening up the camera and looking at the map, it seems as if we're in the lower left-hand side of the cabin. There are two entrances that lead into our room. On the camera panel itself, we're given some tools. There's a music box in each room of the building. It's used to lure things around. However, it only has a limited use, and once it's out, it's out. There's also a camera flash in each of the cameras. This can be used indefinitely, but there's a short second or two cooldown in between each use. This works the same way as the music box, where it's meant to push things back. Putting the camera down and looking over to the right side of the office, there's a notepad. Someone has left a note for Jake. Your friends are dead. I am here to help you. The music on the cameras fools him. Check this notepad frequently. The notepad has two purposes. The first is to provide tips on how to survive with the new tunes that are added each night. It's also a defense against another character, Belial. Over time, Belial will begin to draw herself on the notepad. We need to erase this drawing before it completes itself, which will spawn her. If this were to happen, she can't kill you, but she can sit in the office and make a lot of noise. On top of this, every threat present will speed up and Jake can no longer visit the attic. Speaking of, if we move over to the left of the office, we can go upstairs into the attic, where we can use a lighter to look around. There isn't anything up here yet, so for right now we don't have to worry about it. What we do have to worry about is the only active threat, besides Belial, which is Willie. He'll start in Cam 1 and work his way to your office throughout any of the two entrances. Once he's in, you're as good as dead, so we need to actively keep him from getting towards us. We can do this by using the music box in any room adjacent to where Willie is. He will always move to said room as long as the previous conditions are met. We'll spend most of the first night moving Willie around the top of the map, far away from us, and occasionally checking the notepad and erasing Belial's progress. It's a pretty simple and straightforward first night. This is Postmortem, one of the most divisive sections in the entire game. I think it's entirely because people think it's not explained very well, which I guess I could see, but reading the paper with instructions given to you really helps out. Every time you die, with the exception of one night we'll talk about later, you'll be sent here instead of the immediate game over screen. All you have to do is collect however many Mickey heads are required in the cameras. This mechanic was directly lifted from the cancelled IMSCARED NBD fan game that we talked about a little earlier. The number of Mickey heads I'm pretty sure varies between 3 and 5 depending on what night you're on. However, I'm not entirely sure, so don't quote me on that. What just happened prior to being sent to Postmortem was a scripted death, just to introduce the mechanic. When you load into Postmortem for the first time, you'll be presented with a slip of paper explaining the rules. As to be expected, we aren't alone, but I'm pretty sure you could have figured that out by now. The tunes we have to defend ourselves from are known as the Shades. They come in many forms, but they'll take up PNM, Oswald, Minnie, Goofy, Sadie, and Donald. The Shades as a whole are less mangled versions of the tunes from Treasure Island. They were originally meant for version 2.0 of FNATI as characters who would appear when the lights shut off. In Oblitus Casa, they have a much more prominent role. Anyway, back to the paper. Your best friend will ward off the mouse and the rabbit. Your best friend, or YBF for short, is a Mickey Mouse voodoo doll of sorts. Whenever you see either photo-negative Mickey or Oswald in either of the two doorways in the office, pull out YBF and give him a good stab. That'll send him away. The dog does not like the light, is in reference to Goofy, who will enter in either entrance. He's warded off by using the light on him. However, failure to do so will result in YBF being stolen. The duck will try to trick you. Watch what you collect. refers to Donald. He has a chance to replace a Mickey head with his own. However, it can be hard to see if the head is real or not. The way to tell is if it's glitching out and a somewhat transparent outline of a Donald head can be seen. Then it's a fake. Don't click it. If you do click it, it'll spawn Donald, and just like Disembodied, he'll spawn in front of you and make a ton of noise. As a bonus, you'll be essentially paralyzed for about 5 seconds, so in most cases it's game over. The other mouse does not like to be watched is referring to Minnie, who will occasionally appear in front of you. She can also pull down your monitor when in use. Her mechanic is exactly like Golden Freddy, where if this happens, you just have to flip the monitor back up and you'll be fine. The last line of the note reads, "She is impatient. You must work quickly before the time runs out." The final character of Postmortem is Sadie. She'll stay in Cam 9 the entire time in the carousel. She'll start to leave the room over time, and when she's fully left the room, will insta-kill you. There isn't a way to slow her down or reverse progress, so work quickly and get out of Postmortem as quickly as possible. Once you collect all Mickey heads successfully, you are let go and return to the night, exactly where you left off. The whole section is really cool in my opinion, and is a very skill-based minigame to get back into the game after a slip-up. One more thing I want to mention before moving on, the whole environment is very reminiscent of the Treasure Island office. This is intentional, as it's alluded that Postmortem is Jake's own personal nightmare limbo thing. It's a neat detail, and I'm glad Radiance opted for different mechanics this time around, instead of rehashing the same old ones again. After we leave Postmortem for the first time, the night is over. The morning sun has driven them back into darkness. We now enter my personal favorite part of the entire game. These are the tunnels. They function similar to the Pirate Cavern sections in Treasure Island. However, we have to venture into the tunnels after every night. We get a slip of paper that gives us some basic instructions, but I'll save some time and explain what we're doing. For whatever reason, we are down in the tunnels and need to escape. We can do so by collecting a key in a room on the outskirts of the map. We need to bring said key to the entrance to escape. We're also being stalked by Hourglass, who found their way out of the employee building and into the tunnels with us. The first thing I'll say about the new tunnels is just how impressive this is. Like, they are better in every single way. There are finally walking animations where you can physically move between different halls and rooms by clicking and holding. It really gives off the free roam feel that a lot of popular fan games these days have been implementing, while still feeling grounded in Click Team. Yes, the literal most impressive part of this all is all of this that you're seeing was made entirely in Click Team. The engine went from 2D platformers to FNAF to full 3D environments with pseudo free roam. Keep in mind, this is without the use of Click Team's weird 3D experiment known as Firefly. For a further demonstration of how cool this all is, Click Team feels like a fancier version of PowerPoint. The latest version of Click Team, which this game was made in, was released back in 2013, a near 12-year-old engine that was made exclusively for 2D platformers with extreme memory restrictions is the same game engine that this is running in. The 2.0 tunnels were made by Sunken Studios, who I know knows way too much about Click Team, so it's no surprise they found some crazy workaround to get a near 3D environment in a 2D engine. I could probably say a lot more about how cool this is, but I mean, like just look at it. The tunnels take heavy inspiration from Room Zero, from the Utilidors-esque environment to Hourglass's new redesign featuring a gas mask, which was symbolic in the creepypasta. Everything in the tunnels were made to be where the horror peaks, and it definitely succeeded. The sound design, which I rarely mention, works super well here. The plain ambience matching the plain and repetitive walls works so well to make you feel uneasy and claustrophobic. As soon as you start to tune everything out, a second pair of footsteps can be heard getting louder. It's a stark contrast for sure, and can be super alarming the first time you hear it. A lot of people regard the tunnels as one of the harder parts of the game, but I didn't understand that. By sticking on the edges of the map and making your way around the perimeter, you can find the Mickey room easier and then simply backtrack. If Hourglass does spot you, it's just super easy just to go in pretty much any direction. As long as you remember to go back to the edges of the map once you're far enough away, you can just repeat the cycle and be out in no time. The map itself increases in size with each visit, so if you're not careful, you can very easily be stuck wandering around for way longer than expected. I believe after the first night, the map's area is 3x3 rooms and increases by a multiple every time. So after night 2, the area will be 4x4 rooms and so on. I didn't find this to be very difficult to get a hold of as long as you stick to my strategy, or as long as you get good at getting Hourglass off you. Speaking of, can we talk about Hourglass for a moment? He got a complete makeover after 6.0 released in what Radiance calls it his Gen 2 model. The entire Treasure Island cast got the same treatment, getting new models as well, to be used for another reboot we'll talk about later on. Hourglass's new model was the first to be shown in its entirety because of its prominence in Casa. It's now much dirtier and has accentuated details like hands on its back or the weird vine things. Revealed in a very recent render, Hourglass has a more muddied green hue. Something else I noticed about its design is how it now has a more pronounced human anatomy. I'm sure it was always there, even in the design in 6.0, but I noticed what seems to be a skull of sorts, beyond the Mickey head and even what appears to be actual gums. I could just be looking into this way too deep. I think overall, its design is more in line of it being an amalgamation, more than a giant inky flesh brute thing that we saw in 6.0. Hourglass is the primary threat for each of our visits to the tunnels, and the gameplay loop is pretty much the exact same after each night. Back in the cabin for the second night, and we're joined by two more threats. The first of which is Daisy, who has a chance to appear in any one of the cameras. She only acts as a distraction, as if you change the camera from the one she's on, she'll do whatever this is. To counter this, you need to use the camera flash. Just like Belial, she's another threat who can't really hurt you. However, as long as she's in your office, you'll be unable to do anything. She's another threat that blends into the background once the gameplay really starts to ramp up. So as long as you aren't switching the cameras too quickly, you'll be fine. The second threat is the Face, now going by Corrupted Face. He resides in the attic, and you'll occasionally hear a sound like someone walking around upstairs. This is when you go up to the attic and defend yourself. You use the lighter and hover it over his face to make him go away. He can spawn in one of 4 possible spots in the attic, and using the lighter on him twice will complete his attack phase, so to speak. And you're free to go back downstairs. This whole section is much different than the gameplay up until this point, almost resembling the rat from Candy's 3, where you'd need to shine the light on him to make him disappear. The Face, however, is much faster, and even missing the sweet spot on his face for even a second can kill you. I found that I had to be oddly precise each time I went up to the attic. It was weird at first, and I felt like I was dying a lot more than I should have. Regardless, it's not a hard mechanic to grasp at all, as long as you listen up for the footsteps, which can sometimes be a little quiet. All the mechanics so far are meant to be understandable, covering all the bases for locations and possible entry points for future threats. The gameplay really starts to pick up speed with the next few additions. Speaking of, on night 3 with the addition of Photo Negative Mini. This is a reimagining from the earlier versions of Treasure Island. Eventually, in 3.0, her color palette would be changed to be unphotonegatived, and that version would later evolve into Impurity. She starts off in Cam 2, hanging from the ceiling. Once she's down, she'll make her way towards either office entrance. She can't be lured using the music boxes, but instead can be pushed back a single room by using the camera flash. Since the camera won't run out of flashes so long as it's charged, you really don't need to worry about managing another resource. However, as a trade-off, you no longer have as much control over where she goes. Ideally, you want to keep her in Cam 9 for as long as possible, and only really take the time to deal with her once she progresses 2 or 3 rooms. You can usually do this in between the others. Night 4 introduces the final 2 threats for the main cabin segments, Dippy and Pete. We'll start off with Pete because he is for sure the easiest character in the entire game. Occasionally, when you hear the sound cue to go up to the attic and deal with Face, you'll instead see Pete standing there. As long as you don't use your lighter at all and go back downstairs, you'll be fine. It takes like a split second whenever in the attic to make sure it's not Pete, and if it is, you can just go back to doing whatever you were before. The only way I think people would ever die to Pete is if they were instinctively holding right click for the lighter when going up. So don't do that. The other, much harder threat is Dippy, very much resembling Goofy. Dippy is a new character that was made for Oblitus Casa. His name and design were heavily inspired by the early cartoons from the 30s. Gameplay-wise, he's essentially Willy, however, he'll try to get into your office through the window, so that means keeping him away from Cam 9. Willy and Dippy are on opposite tracks to the office, so it's ideal to lure them both together. The strategy that I found that worked the absolute best was starting off the night by getting them both into Cam 1 and then down to the bathroom in Cam 5. This is where they would be lured to whenever they leave until 2 AM. Then the spot they'd be sent would change to Cam 1 until 4 AM, and then finally the kitchen, Cam 5, from 4 AM to the end of the night. This works pretty well for me, but does require that you're also fast with the other threats as well, since once they get too far out of reach, it's much harder to get them back into the same camera again. After night 4, we're back in the tunnels like usual. However, after making our way to the exit after completing the section, something different happens. Hourglass is no more, being burned alive in the supply closet. The tunes from Treasure Island are no more. However, the burning of Hourglass was not liked by a shadowy figure. Its presence consumes the screen as we're reminded what this is. It's the same Shadow Mickey from the ending of Treasure Island. This figure thing is Mother, and finally we have the primary threat of Oblitus Casa. Mother is a little upset at us for killing Hourglass. This whole monologue, from what I've heard, was written to recontextualize the characters we face on the island as more than just threats. In Mother's words, they're her children of sorts, and she's become this parental figure of them. Killing off Hourglass was the only thing she had left of her children. She phrases the tunes as if they were confused and unsure of what their purpose was or what we wanted coming to the island. With that bit of context, she reveals that she's an embodiment of the island, of everything. Mother was heavily inspired by God from the earlier FNATI games. God was only what I can assume to be an attempt at adding additional lore onto the original creepypasta. Abandoned by God, they said. Who's God? This thing. The influence on Mother is there, but beyond that, it's really hard to say what Mother actually is. Mother finishes her monologue by ensuring that we end here. And hey, Night 5! This is the boss fight of sorts. It's a night entirely dedicated to Mother and the face for some reason. I don't know why, he's just there. There's only one active character that's roaming around the cabin, Mother's physical form, Mick. Mick actually had a more prevalent role in both 3.0 and 4.0 of Treasure Island, originally being the replacement for photo-negative Mickey in 3.0 before being replaced by Willy, and in 4.0 being the final replacement and main character. Obviously, since 4.0 never released, getting to see Mick again in a prominent role is pretty neat. Mick, in a similar way to Hourglass, is all the mechanics meshed into one. Unlike Hourglass, he's infinitely easier to read. He will try to make his way into your office through either of the two entrances. He thankfully cannot get in through the window, so that means you're best off keeping him in Cam 9 as far away from you as possible. Mick can be lured by both the music box and the camera flash, but which one works is dependent on his eyes. If you can see them, use the camera flash. If not, use the music box. Mick also fills the role of Pete. Just like the previous nights, when you hear footsteps above you, you need to go into the attic and deal with Face. However, there's a chance that the one making these sounds is Mick, and going upstairs will result in an insta-kill. So every time you hear the attic sound cue, you need to quickly search the cameras and make sure that he's still there. If not, you just wait for him to get back. Mother is also a threat despite also being Mick. She's mostly there to fill the spots that Mick couldn't. Just like Daisy, she'll occasionally be on one of the cameras making the same sound effect. She also replaces Belial appearing on the notepad. The same mechanic applies here too. I said earlier that the face is here for some reason. It's most likely because of Mick's attic mechanic, and not having a reason to go up there at all would make it completely pointless. In the extras menu, it's revealed that this version of Face in Night 5 is a completely different version than the one we had been encountering in the attic before. This is Inkblot Face, and he's fundamentally the same as Corrupted Face, but his design and mechanic have been altered slightly. His jaw is more unhinged and he seems to be sporting some red clothes. Inkblot Face's mechanic requires that you use the lighter on him 6 times in quicker succession. At 3 AM, everything stops for a moment. The outside goes black and this weird sound can be heard. After a moment, everything appears to have returned to normal. Mick, however, has increased in size, gaining a more lanky appearance. His proportions, while still very cartoony, are more human, especially in his hands and feet. This kicks off the second phase of the fight, where everything is now at a much faster pace. I'm gonna be honest, I didn't really notice that much of a difficulty increase like I was expecting. I think I died maybe once past 3 AM. Night 5, from my general experience, is not as hard as I was expecting it to be. I did for sure struggle figuring everything out, like exactly how Mick behaved, but once you've died to everything once or twice, everything becomes much easier. Just like every night before it, once 6 AM comes around, it's all over. And that's Oblitus Casa, the main story at least. We still have a lot left to cover, don't worry. Coming back to the main menu after the credits, we get our first star, and clicking on it brings us to 5 nights at Treasure Island Oddities. Oh, no, just kidding, sorry. The blue screen does have some stuff written, however. It goes over the idea of how a FNATI 3 would be amusing, but the team is ready to move on, especially from fan games. Instead, they've put the games in the series in a place where if you really wanted a continuation, you can always just make one yourself. I thought it was pretty sincere, and it's worth reading. After coming back to the main menu, we also unlocked a secret 6th night. Going in, I thought it would have been a much harder Night 4, but no, it's a harder Night 5. There's also a custom night complete with challenge presets. as well as another row of characters that are locked. We'll talk a bit more about them in a minute, but they can individually be unlocked in a pretty unique way. We can also switch modes from the main cabin segments to a post-mortem custom night. The post-mortem custom night as well has its own challenges in max modes. I think it's a really cool addition. We don't get a custom night for the tunnels, which I guess makes sense since there's only one threat, and I can see how people would much rather have the tunnels be used in a unique way. However, there's one more part to the custom night. As another piece of extra content on top of the already pretty deeply packed main campaign, Radiance threw in a set of 4 new challenges that better utilize some of the locations featured in the story. Better yet, these challenges feature some of the most iconic creepypasta icons. We got Jeff the Killer, Slenderman, Smile Dog, and Eyeless Jack, some of which I didn't even know had canonical designs, and yet here they are. I know that creepypastas have had a lot to do with some of the earlier pre-Radiance era games, but seeing them back included in a canon game with this much prevalence is undoubtedly super cool. I want to take a moment and talk about each of the 4 challenges, as well as gush about some of the new gameplay choices for a moment. Starting off with Jeff the Killer, the first challenge most players will play. This I found to be the second easiest of the bunch, only taking me about 20 minutes for my first completion. We're back in the post-mortem office for this one. The gameplay is very reminiscent of Funtime Freddy's minigame from Sister Location, where you need to slowly reboot, in this case, all 10 cameras. Jeff the Killer will at first slowly make his way to your office by entering through either door. As a general rule of thumb, it's important to always reboot cams 7 and 2 immediately, as these are the 2 entrances in which Jeff will be last seen before attacking. After rebooting these 2 cameras, going in any order is fine. However, after this point, Jeff will attack increasingly quickly, so that means only rebooting the camera a couple of ticks before checking those 2 cameras. I found the best strategy was to reboot about 5 ticks and quickly cycle between the 2 cameras, and go back for another 5 ticks. If he was in any of those 2 cameras, I would go back and reboot for about another tick, and then immediately put down the camera and flash the hall. Anything past about 5 cameras rebooted, and Jeff will move extremely quickly. Not only to the door, but it feels like maybe a second from when he leaves the camera to him killing you. This is where about 90% of my deaths in this one were, right at the end when I underestimated how fast he'd move. There's also another factor on top of this that makes this one challenging, and that's the power. You only have a certain amount of light power that will ward off Jack, so that means if you aren't quick enough or use the light more than you should, you're as good as dead. Overall, not a super hard challenge, but it's still tricky, especially if you lose your cycle and have to make decisions on the fly. The second, and probably second hardest challenge is Slenderman. This one took me about 40 minutes to beat for the first time, and most of that time was spent aimlessly wandering around the tunnels. The goal is to collect 8 pages, which should be very familiar given that it's the same gameplay as Slender the 8 pages. As I alluded, we're back in the tunnels, and with an actual reason to wander around as we're set out to collect the pages. This challenge will take a little bit, so a strategy I had at the start was to walk around but not collect any of the pages. I would literally pull up MS Paint and draw the locations of each page so I could cut down the time in between looking. This one gets super monotonous because once you collect the first page, Slenderman will start following you around. He will generally spawn in front of you and will teleport again in front of you when you turn away. Losing him is for sure what makes this one as hard as it is, because it definitely takes a while and you need to be extremely patient. He'll always turn the screen grayscale whenever he's looking around, so it's not like he's super unfair, he's just annoying. Paired with the fact that you're looking for white pages on white walls, and this one can become mildly aggravating. It never felt unfair, but I had to stop in the middle of my playthrough and go try out other challenges before I sunk more time into it. A lot of people I've talked to about Casa have said that Slenderman is the hardest, but I'm gonna disagree right now, because there's another that I felt was a little harder. But let's first talk about the easiest, Smile Dog, the third challenge. This one takes place in the cabin and uses the same mechanics as in the base game. We need to erase Smile Dog's drawings from the notepad. Periodically, it'll start to repair itself. This means we need to go into the cameras and use the flash when we see Smile Dog. If we can't see him in the cameras, then it means he's in the attic and we need to use the lighter on him. This can happen multiple times, and it'll sometimes take multiple flashes in order for him to go away entirely. This one wasn't too difficult since I completed it on my literal first attempt. It also was pretty short, all things considered. It only took me about 2 minutes compared to the 5+ minutes for the others. Okay, I have a love-hate relationship with the final creepypasta, Eyeless Jack. For me, this was the hardest of the 4 challenges and took me multiple sessions to beat for the first time. I'll explain the reasoning in a moment because it's not entirely because it was hard. I mean, it definitely is difficult, but it's not like the hardest skill-wise. So we're back in the tunnels in complete darkness. We have to navigate around by using the compass and eyeless Jack's footsteps. We do have a camera and can use its flash to briefly illuminate the surrounding area, but it has a small recharge. Besides, it's important not to spam it. Our goal is to take 5 pictures of Jack. We have to do so by listening for his footsteps and getting close enough to get a good picture of him, which will add 1 for our counter and reset Jack. However, if we use our camera flash and we're close enough to Jack without being in picture range, he'll give chase for a moment before going back to whatever he was doing before. Once you get all the photos you need, the minigame ends. No stumbling around for an exit. So if Jeff took me about 20 minutes, Slender about 40, and Smile Dog on the first attempt, I'd say all my attempts combined, eyeless Jack took about 2 hours. For starters, I found walking around in the complete darkness to be a little difficult at first. I eventually relied entirely on the compass in the top right for pretty much everything movement-wise, and the audio for where I needed to go. Speaking of audio, I found the headset that I brought to college, where I played pretty much every game in this video, has horrible directional audio. I think it's entirely a SteelSeries issue with their awful software, but I genuinely could not for the life of me track where Jack was. I waited until I got home to use my better pair to beat him. I think in general, eyeless Jack is difficult because it uses a completely different skill set than the one that you've been building throughout the playthrough. While audio is a large factor sometimes, especially in the main night segments, it's never really impressed upon until now. At least that was my understanding. While Jack's footsteps are really loud, it felt that they were a bit louder than they should be, and I would often take a photo while not in picture range. For the first couple of attempts, this would usually result in an insta-kill, until I realized Jack is pretty slow and running away is actually really easy. But even still, after running away, Jack disappears for a while, or at least spawns in a new area, making you repeat the process all over again. On top of that, there's an added time limit. I'm not really sure how long it is, but from what I've been told, it's at least 6 minutes. I never had an issue with it, but knowing it was there in the back of my head always stressed me out a little bit. Aside from the confusion of the audio and the lack of sight, I absolutely adore the atmosphere in this minigame. The ambient music box track is perfect and doesn't get in the way of the footsteps you'll need to be listening for. The general gameplay loop is really good, having you chase the enemy in the tunnels for once. Although it took me way too long to get the hang of, this is a really fun challenge. Oddly enough, I'd consider this one my favorite. And with that, we've finished all the creepypasta challenges. They're probably my favorite addition to the game that really honors its source material and the communities which spawn from them. I just really like stuff like this, and the fact that each challenge is super well crafted too. As a reward for beating each challenge, you unlock a new character in the custom night, as well as the creepypasta themselves as an entry in the extras menu. If you complete all creepypasta challenges, you'll notice that there's one more character to unlock to complete the custom night. They're unlocked by completing Nightmare mode, which is essentially one of the first max modes of Oblitus Casa, this one having you up against all the base game characters at their hardest. Something that a lot of newer Radiance games have done is having multiple max modes, usually for different parts of the game. Nightmare mode is the first max mode, and completing it unlocks the final custom night character and the final challenge, True Nightmare. Unfortunately, I haven't beaten True Nightmare yet. Believe it or not, it is quite literally many times harder than 50-20. I promise I'll do it someday really soon. My best time is about 3:30. Beating True Nightmare unlocks the final cutscene. I'm gonna summarize this because it's really worth unlocking and watching on your own. So spoilers ahead if you don't want that. The cutscene is of Henry, somehow beyond the dead, sitting in front of us with a Mickey mask covering his face. He talks about how he didn't believe in Jake at first, and how it's truly a miracle that we were able to stop what had been happening on the island. Apparently, deaths and disappearances had been happening over and over again. We were the ones to finally put Mother and her children down and stop it all together. Henry reveals that he was Undying, the weird Mickey suit in Treasure Island. After the events of that game, he was the one leaving the notes for us around the cabin. Henry is the reason we are still alive. He thanks us for giving him and the island closure. The cutscene ends before we can learn any more. There are a lot of really neat details that this cutscene provides. In general, it's an incredibly cathartic 3-minute watch, but with that cutscene, we've finally completed everything Oblitus Casa has to offer. In my time writing this video, I don't think I've thought longer about a game than I have with Oblitus Casa. It's not like anything in Casa is necessarily thought-provoking. It tells a decent story about seeking refuge in a cabin while defending against cartoons, killing a goop monster, and God alongside it. But I think the reason I've thought so much about Casa is just in reflection to the developers and listening to the people on the team gush about the game they were making. I've talked to a fair amount of people on either the team or those who playtested, and as far as I can recall, not a single one of them has had a a negative thing to say about either the project, the other team members, or even the community as a whole. Every conversation with some of them, they'd mention something about Casa, and usually include a play Casa or wait for 2.0 somewhere in the conversation. It's very obvious from the amount of depth and detail Casa has that it was carefully made to be a game that not just FNATI fans wanted to play, but others who aren't even remotely involved in the abandoned by Disney / FNATI fandoms. This work very much paid off, as it's become increasingly more evident that Radiance uses Casa 2.0 as a benchmark for their future projects, including their remake of 6.0, which we'll get to in a minute. All of this rambling and weirdly introspective thought to say that I don't believe the point of Oblitus Casa was what Radiance was directly putting in front of you. Instead, everything around it. It takes everything we've known about Treasure Island and Abandoned by Disney from the past 9 years at that point, and ties all the loose ends. But instead of leaving it there, they hand it off to you to do whatever with. As Radiance even said in their little troll blue screen, they've opened up the series to the fans to make whatever interpretation they wish going forward. You don't need Radiance, or Anart, or Slimebeast, or really anyone else to build upon the story, or hell, any other story than yourself. And the result of that is an incredibly dedicated community. Seriously, the FNATI community is one of the strongest and most populated subcommunities in the horror space. Even more so as they distance themselves from FNAF. Casa was made for the community, by the community. And who knows, maybe there'll be another developer or two to carry the torch and continue the story from here. I'm not trying to say that Oblitus Casa is some super deep game with these crazy meanings, because it's very much not. I think it's interesting because of what it came from and how it evolved. Most games that make such an improvement over time as this aren't because of an entire community, but usually one person or a group of people that helped make it happen. But this is one of those rare cases where it was a community effort. I'm going to finish the section off here, asking you to try Casa for yourself. It's seriously one of the most impressive games I've played in a while. I don't see discussion for it dying down anytime soon. So you know how I just said that Radiance had come to terms with leaving FNATI off after Casa to move on to other things? Well, scratch that, because sometime before Casa 2.0's release, Radiance posted models of some weird looking characters for some project they were working on. Radiance's promise to move on from FNATI didn't last long because these are characters for Nightmare Below Disney, better known as FNATI 3. Literally a month is all it took for Radiance to crack and make another FNATI. The game was teased with some really good nightmarish renditions of the nightmares from NBD, and that's pretty much all the teasing we got for this thing. I'm dead serious, 3 teasers just kind of appeared and then a final one at the end of October announcing that on Halloween night, Nightmare Below Disney would be releasing for everyone to play. And yeah, sure enough, a game did release on Halloween night, and after downloading and opening the file, it's apparent what this is. The game opens on a TV with the Nightmare Below Disney logo. Interacting brings us to the menu, which only offers a custom night. The custom night has 12 characters separated into 3 different branches. Each branch has its own theme of sorts, like Branch R is all the new Radiance modeled characters, Branch C is the remade NBD characters, and Branch D has either miscellaneous or previously scrapped characters. Hitting start brings us into the main gameplay. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, this is another troll game. We get a Pizza Sim inspired cutscene that explains our job, how Disney wants to shut down Animal Kingdom and reopen Treasure Island, but renamed to Red Island. You can see where this is going. There's a good amount of detail to the earlier FNATI games as well. After that cutscene, we get another cutscene with some Mickey looking thing. He's really only there to give us some extremely vague exposition about what we're doing here and what the plot of the game is going to be. Pretty much, we're being sent below some facility and have to spend 5 nights there completing tasks. And if that all sounds familiar, it's because this is just Pizza Sim, but without the sim. So, just pizza. The gameplay takes place over 5 nights with salvage sections breaking up the nights. I'm gonna quickly run over the Office gameplay and salvage gameplay because it's pretty much all the same, just a new character gets added each night. This is the Office. It's very reminiscent of Pizza Sim's Office segments. This time you can also look behind you. For each of the 2 vents on your left and right, you get a mask, which works how it always does, and behind you get some sort of flashlight that shines a bright light down the hall for a second. On the monitor in front of you there are 3 tabs, one for tasks, another for cameras, and one for ventilation. All of them are straightforward. You can complete the tasks by clicking and waiting, and the cameras can be used to view different parts of the area around you. Although I'm unsure of exactly where they're located, the final tab is for ventilation, which is only used for 1 character, so we're gonna ignore it for now. Speaking of, on the first night, all we have to deal with is Scrap Candace, who will come from the right vent and we have to use our mask whenever she's in the vent. On the second night, we have to listen for a directional audio cue from Molten D's and turn on the heater in the side of the vent he's on. For the third night, we'll have to occasionally turn around and flash Scrap face whenever he's in the hall. For night 4, we have to use the mask again when Charmy can be seen in the left vent. And we'll talk about what to do in night 5 just in a moment. I said earlier that in between each night there's a salvage scrap section to break up the gameplay. It's almost identical to how the scrap segments in Pizza Sim play out, the main difference being there is literally no reason to try to play these. I mean, you don't have an option to accept or deny the salvage, and they're always going to be added the next night regardless of what happens. If you did want to try, the minigame plays out exactly the same, except you have to smack the robots with an empty soda can if they're about to move. You only get 3 cans, kind of how you only get 3 shocks on the animatronics in Pizza Sim before you lose money. These sections are alright, I guess. They just weren't my favorite things to play ever. Night 5, however, is where I believe the main game peaks. So you'll have to complete tasks as usual, but you may notice that the tasks take only a second or two to be completed, so naturally you'll finish in like 10 seconds, and that's when a 5th task appears on the monitor. Order weapon off deep web. Once you do, you'll be given a gun and the real night begins. There's this undying wannabe wandering around with a chainsaw, and whenever he steps into the office, it's our job to shoot it. This is far for, and sadly, he only gets a couple minutes of screen time before we shoot him enough times and he just explodes, thus concluding the masterpiece that is Nightmare Below Disney, or 7 Days Free, which is oddly enough what the actual game is called. For some reason, I'm in the special thanks section of the credits, making me official in the FNATI canon. I don't remember what I did, or even if I did anything at all. I didn't even know I was there until a couple months after the game had launched. It was definitely a surprise seeing it on my first playthrough because I completely forgotten about it. Also, because of this, I have an IMDb page. I don't know how to access this or how to add other stuff to it, but you know, it's there. Radiance always puts their projects on IMDb, although I'm not sure why. It's possible that it's for a resume or portfolio of some sort. However, after the credits end, a small cutscene plays, thus officially confirming the remake for 6.0. So now it's officially confirmed by Radiance. Later that day, actually, after the game had been out for a few hours, Radiance would confirm the game themselves on their social media, so I'm sure there wasn't a massive incentive to play the game after this. But yeah, that's really about it for Nightmare Below Disney, or 7 Days Free, whatever you want to call this thing. There are some extras and a custom night with 2 additional characters, but I really didn't look much further than that. We're finally closing in on the end of this nightmare. There's just one more game left to talk about. As I was desperately trying to finish this video up in time for a release on December 1st, Radiance started to hint at something that would happen within the near future. First, they changed their social media accounts to feature a yellow color scheme. Then, their logo started to warp and distort. Everyone, including myself, thought it had something to do with the FNATI 10th anniversary, and while we were right, what they were doing was still a mystery. I even contacted Nocturna, who I had told previously I was making this video, if I should just wait until after the anniversary, you know, just in case. I didn't get a very straightforward answer. About a week to go until the anniversary, and Radiance uploaded a cryptic video onto their channel. It featured a new but dated version of Photo Negative Mickey, as it showed him taking his head off. The description reads, "Have you seen this game?" 2 days later, another video was uploaded, the description also reading the same thing. This bi-daily upload schedule carried out until the early morning of December 1st, where the 4th and final video was posted. A couple of keen-eyed viewers took each video when they were uploaded and brightened them, each revealing a 7-character code of sorts. Because of the way each code was structured, it appeared to be part of a link, and it didn't take very long for people to start plugging each code into Imager, where they'd find 4 pieces of a larger teaser. If you brightened that teaser, you'd find a link for the game page for Treasure Island Abandoned Enigma. The game page would remain hidden for most of the day until Radiance posted publicly that they had found a build and it would be out for all to play. So yeah, we have another game to play. Just when I thought I was finished. I do have to say though, I was pleasantly surprised that this game actually holds up really well, given the dated aesthetic the developers were going for. Radiance posted the game with the context that this was an old build for a FNAF fan game based on Abandoned by Disney, with the old game page being publicized on December 1st, 2014, the same day Anart released a demo. Something interesting to note from the supposed Wayback Machine screenshot Radiance provided, that Abandoned Enigma was developed by Acid Rain, which, if you remember from earlier, was the same development team responsible for Anniversary Edition and other Radiance Remastered 5 Nights to Remember. You may also remember that Acid Rain is just an anagram for Radiance. Speaking of Anniversary Edition, there are a ton of parallels between the two games. Initially, Abandoned Enigma was teased under AE, which also stands for Anniversary Edition. I'm sure this was done on purpose, as Abandoned Enigma feels like a much better version of that game. Come to think of it, it makes a ton of sense since I'm sure by now you know they're remaking 6.0. So a remake of Anniversary Edition was probably in order. Anyway, the build Radiance had released was being labeled as just a demo. There isn't anything beyond that. Just a relic of the past being publicized once again, supposedly. Okay, I'm gonna drop the act. Abandoned Enigma is a full game that is labeled as a demo for a pretty clever reason that I'll explain shortly. Enough wasting time, let's open the game and get going with this. Abandoned Enigma has a menu very reminiscent of Anniversary Edition, but with a much more dated style. There actually isn't a lot to do on the menu right now, so the only thing we can do is start the first night. Loading into the office, and we're hit with just a wall of text in the top left. You can hide under the desk by pressing Shift, turn off cameras with space, use left click to shut a door, and right click to use a flashlight in the doorway. You can even turn around to a power box behind you. We do get a phone call from some unnamed phone guy, and he gives us the basic rundown. It's exactly how literally any version of FNATI, so by now you should probably know exactly who's active this night and how to get rid of them. So I'll take the time to explain what the power thing does behind you. Let's just say you're in a position where you're essentially dead. You can flip the power switch and it'll start the power out sequence. This will take exactly 1 hour of the night and reset the main cast when it's complete and you've survived. The mechanics are completely different, where you have to use your flashlight to ward off the spirits, as they're called. There are some that will growl at the light, in which case you don't use it on them. Some of them may ignore the light entirely, where you just shut the door on them. And finally, if any of them were to get too close, you would have to hide under the desk. This section may be pretty reminiscent of Postmortem from Oblitus Casa, where you have a second chance at life if you can complete a skill-based minigame. I really like this idea if I hadn't already made it pretty obvious, and I wish more ideas like this were included more often. But back to the main night after we successfully fend off Photo-Negative Mickey, or as he's called in this game as Inverted Mickey, we can move on. However, after the 6 AM screen, the File Explorer opens. It's for a folder on the desktop titled Output, and in it is an untitled text file. It appears to be a chat log from some group chat in early September 2014. To summarize, it's essentially a group chat that was created for the creation of the very game we're playing. This is where things can get a little confusing, so I'll try my best to explain everything. This group chat contains members of Acid Rain, and all of these characters are a part of the Abandoned by Disney universe. Each one of these characters represents a different member of Radiance. Pretty much, these guys want to make a FNAF fan game based on the blog post about Discovery Island. This first log is essentially one of the members explaining their idea for said game based on the creepypasta, which in their case isn't a creepypasta, but something that really happened. That's pretty much where the based on a true story tagline comes in. Anyway, it's important to check this output folder frequently, as there will be new logs for completing certain parts of the game. The logs going forward give hints towards certain mechanics and how to access the later parts of the game, considering that it's still pretty much marketed as a demo. Something I didn't know until much later is that these logs are presented in a similar way to IMSCARED, which, if you remember from earlier, was the inspiration for an early NBD/FNATI game. The way this series has managed to come full circle in some ways is just amazing. Going forward into Night 2, and again, it's exactly like how every FNATI Night 2 goes. Oswald, now named Darkwald, gets introduced and, just like Photo-Negative Mickey, is dealt with by shutting off a camera in another room. I promise that's really about as far as it goes for mechanics that carry over. This is because Donald makes his first appearance as well tonight, and he has a different mechanic. When he's seen in the doorway, we need to hold it shut and listen for his footsteps that tell us he's left. After the second night, we're met with an end of demo screen. You know, it's too bad there's nothing that could tell us how to potentially bypass it. Oh wait, the logs. Just like the first night, there's a new text file in the output folder. It tells us that by pressing 3 specific keys on the keyboard when on the demo over screen, it'll load us into the third night. Anyway, now onto the third night, we get introduced to 2 more characters. The first of which is Goofy, and he shares the same mechanic with Donald, needing to hold the door shut on him. The second new character is Inverted Minnie, who has a similar mechanic to her Oblitus Casa counterpart. Essentially, you want to continuously be pushing her back. To do so, you want to shut off a camera in a room adjacent to her, which she'll go into. I found what worked best for her was whenever she got to cam 2, you'd switch to cam 9 and shut off that room, and then go one back to cam 10 and shut that off too. This would keep her 2 rooms back in an area pretty much secluded from any other threat, so you realistically wouldn't need to worry about shutting off the camera with anyone else inside. Just like her mechanic in Casa, if she were to get to your door, you're pretty much dead. There's nothing you can really do in that situation except toggle the power down sequence if you hadn't already. Halfway through night 3 at 3 AM, the gameplay switches to Pirate Catacombs. Our goal is to find 6 pieces of paper scattered throughout the map, each of them containing a number. This 6-digit number is then used to unlock a safe near the elevator we came down. Just like pretty much every version of Pirate Caverns, we also have to avoid the face. We just have to shut off our light whenever he's on screen. The Pirate Catacombs in Abandoned Enigma is for sure where a lot of the 5.0 and older FNAF fan game aesthetic really shines. A lot of these areas look really accurate to how the game would have looked in 2014. After we have the code and unlock the safe, Undying will make an appearance and will chase us back to the elevator. I probably shouldn't even refer to this as a chase because moving too quickly will result result in being killed. I actually died multiple times where I backed up too quickly. It's not super clear how you're supposed to avoid him, and paired with the intense-ish music that plays when he spawns, really gave me the wrong impression. However, this counts for completing the third night, and we get another file. This time, it goes over how to defend against the two characters that were in the pirate catacombs, but since they'll both be added to night 4, I might as well just explain how both of them work. Face, now going by Distorted Mickey, will occasionally climb an event and appear in front of you in the office starting a FNAF 2-like blackout sequence. During this, we have to keep the monitor up until it's over. The same can be said for Undying, whose new name in this game is the Red Man. Real creative guys. He's always in the office, in the supply closet directly in front of us. Over time, he'll slowly make his way out of the closet until he's right in front of us. In this case, we have to hide under the desk until his blackout sequence is over. Another file is added to the folder after night 4, and it shows the group chat getting into an argument about the game work distribution. I think it's supposed to show how similar this group chat is to potential real-world development chats and how a similar thing can happen. For the final night of the main game, we get introduced to Old Timer, this humanoid hourglass equivalent. He works the exact same as the Red Man, as we'll just need to hide under the desk. The file we get after night 5 tells us how we can access the 6th night, which adds one more character. To get into the night, we have to wait on the menu and trigger the classic menu jump scare, where instead of crashing our game after, it'll put us into the night. The new character this time around is Harry Gravel, and is essentially our equivalent for Henry. Harry is a headless corpse thing who shares a similar mechanic to the Red Man and Old Timer. You have to hide under the desk when he enters the room, and you can preemptively lure him into the office by shutting off the camera he's on. The 6th night in general wasn't too complicated, and we got another file for completing it. Basically, there's more drama in the group chat, and we get some more keys to press to access the custom night as well as extras menu. There are a total of 9 files you can collect, from what I've been told, so I'll quickly go over how to get them and what they talk about. You can get the 7th file by going into the custom night and turning Pete, or the captain, a custom night exclusive character, on and dying to him. The file is the group chat talking about the captain's importance in the game and another member attempting to convince the others to add some George character to the game. I actually don't remember how I unlocked the 8th file, I just kinda had it when I checked the folder after getting the 9th file. If I remember, I'll put it in the pinned comment. But the file talks about the scrapping of Captain and Dismembered, who is Daisy but uses Disembodied's old mechanic. The 9th file can be attained by completing the Abandoned by God preset in the custom night, which is just 1120. The team is in disagreement about the current state of the game and are wanting to spend more time redoing certain portions. There's also an Imager link for what appears to be a remake of the oldest FNATI teaser, the one Anart posted to his DeviantArt page in November 2014, but remade in the Abandoned Enigma style. I think it's really cool, but after this file, that's pretty much it for Abandoned Enigma. If I hadn't made it very obvious from this section, I really liked Abandoned Enigma. I feel like it really gets what made those early fan games so special to a lot of people, and some of the details and callbacks to projects around the time. I don't think I could recommend this enough. This game is absolutely fantastic. And with that, we have completed every FNATI game, at least for the time being. So what's next for FNATI? Well, we can expect a couple of things in the coming months or even years. While Radiance said that their involvement in the FNATI series was practically over, we know that not to be the case with the ending of their last game. There are 3 upcoming official FNATI projects that haven't been released yet, so I'm going to take a moment and go over them all briefly. The first upcoming project has already started. Addendum Discovery Island is one of the first non-games in relation to FNATI. It's a writing project created and ran by Radiance, taking place after the events of Treasure Island and Oblitus Casa. It's more so Radiance's way of wrapping up their story without the need to make more games, which I find pretty interesting. It even feels super faithful to the creepypasta's origin, each page of the project getting released one at a time. I haven't read it because I've been so busy with the rest of this video, but it's entirely free and you can find it on Twitter. The second upcoming FNATI project is a game by Celowisps called Hypangogia, I think. I'm unsure if it's technically considered official, but it's a reimagining of what could have been NBD 2. The game page says it's the official rebirth of the entire NBD concept. It's being made in Unreal Engine, and from the teasers looks to be a free roam horror game. However, it's been stated that they are trying to shift the game to a more original concept because of burnout with FNATI. Regardless of its future, it's worth supporting. Alright, finally the big one. As stated earlier, Radiance is remaking 6.0. They made it very clear that it should not be considered as FNATI 7.0, but rather as a remaster of 6.0. So the community and team have opted to call it 6.5. The whole remake exists to live up to the standards of gameplay and presentation that Oblitus Casa 2.0 had. So far, it looks to be doing exactly that. Everything from the ground up is being remade, including the models. All characters now have a Gen 2 model and a similar upgrade that Hourglass got in Casa. Visually speaking, the game looks really good. I'm sure you could pick it up yourself though. As for the gameplay, there still isn't a whole lot known. We know it was one of the main things that Radiance wanted to fix. not having every character function similarly. It's safe to assume that everyone will be getting a bit of a rework, but I'm also sure that the typical shutting off camera mechanic will still be included. I would also assume that Hourglass would also be reworked to be a bit more readable and fair. Finally, arguably the biggest change is the rework to Pirate Caverns. I'm unsure how it's different, but the environment got a massive upgrade. I'm also curious if the system for navigating the tunnels in Casa will return in some way just for this section. Again, while there isn't too much known at the moment for what 6.5 will look like on release, Radiance is posting screenshots of their progress frequently on their socials, and of course I'll be playing it when it releases. This video was kind of a nightmare to make. FNATI being notoriously hard to find accurate information on was annoying. It didn't help that I tried my best to finish this video in a little under 2 months. Originally I wanted this video to be released on December 1st, the 10th anniversary, but I very much did not make that because of other obligations outside of this video. Regardless, I'm still proud that I managed to finish this thing after many months of work and many more months before that planning out how I would go about this. I do plan on making more videos like this in the future, going over the entire series instead of individual games since it's more interesting and it helps add more context. I think that's why I enjoyed 6.0 and Oblitus Casa as much as I did, because I had the background of the other games that came before it. As per usual with these videos, I have some people to thank. Of course, the people in Radiance who gave their support and thoughts during the video's production. I know there's a ton of other videos that cover the series, but their support of mine and really helping me understand the series was super appreciated. I also want to thank How To Animate, who made the new channel art and also convinced me to look into FNATI again. Milkburger, who made a ton of renders for this video that I couldn't find a way to use, but I just wanted to mention him here. The FNATI community in general has also been a massive support, whether that being with fact-checking, proofreading, or providing some general insight. I probably wouldn't have included most of the details and little insights as I would have without them. This as well includes the incredibly useful FNATI wiki pages that lay out literally everything this series has to offer. Finally, I want to thank the 3 channel members that I have at the moment. I re-enabled memberships a little bit ago and I don't think I've mentioned them before, so the support is always appreciated. If you want to see more videos like this just early, consider becoming a member. That's all I really have. Thank you for making it to the end of another outrageously long video. I need some time to rest, so I'll see you in a few weeks.